Hey there, welcome back to Mr. Rovega Stories. I know a lot of you come here to unwind, to let your mind drift and fall asleep. So before you get too cozy, I'd really love it if you could leave a little comment, just telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if these stories help you relax, feel free to like and subscribe. It means more than you know. All right, let's get comfortable, take a slow breath, and begin. A child vanished in seconds. The footprints told a different story. The search teams later said the footprints were the strangest part of the entire case. They led clearly across loose soil near the tree line, then changed shape in a way no one wanted to explain. The child disappeared so fast that investigators first suspected a simple wandering accident, but the tracks forced them to reconsider everything. 7-year-old Aiden Ralden traveled with his mother, Mira, to a quiet campground near a forested ridge outside a small mountain town. She worked long shifts at a distribution center and promised him a weekend of fresh air before school piled on more stress. The campground had a small creek, a short nature trail, and enough open space for kids to run safely. Several families returned to the area each year because nothing unusual ever happened there, according to the ranger logs. They arrived late Saturday morning, pitched a small tent near the lower loop, and met a nearby couple who recognized Mira from previous summers. The weather stayed mild, with a steady breeze coming down the ridge. Aiden played near the picnic table with a toy truck, while Mira prepared a simple lunch. Everything remained normal, according to witnesses who later reviewed the timeline. Around 1 in the afternoon, a young hiker named Ren Vero stopped at the campground before heading to the creek. He greeted the families and noticed Aiden building a small dirt ramp for his truck near the start of the nature trail. Mira chatted briefly with Ren while keeping Aiden well within view. Several people later confirmed that nothing seemed off or concerning. Aiden asked if he could run a little farther down the trail to collect smooth stones. Mira agreed, but told him to stay where she could see the first 2 bends. He nodded and sprinted forward. Ren recalled hearing the rustle of leaves as the boy disappeared around the first turn. Mira wiped her hands on a towel, glanced toward the bend, and continued arranging their food. Less than a minute passed before she called his name. No answer came back. She stood, walked several steps toward the trail, and called again. Still nothing. Ren joined her and listened carefully. Both heard only wind moving through the upper branches, without the usual chatter of birds that normally perched in that area. They reached the first bend and found the boy's toy truck resting upright on the soil. Small footprints led away from the truck toward the next curve in the path. Mira knelt and shouted again. Ren sprinted forward to check the next section. He expected to find Aiden crouched near the creek or hiding behind a stump. Instead, he saw a short stretch of fresh footprints that suddenly ended halfway between 2 old cedar trunks. Searchers later examined those prints carefully. Each one before the cedar trunks matched Aiden's shoes perfectly. The spacing and depth indicated a normal running stride. What confused everyone was the last part. The final 2 impressions grew slightly deeper than the previous ones, as if he pushed off hard. After those 2 prints, the soil remained undisturbed, smooth and unbroken. Mira called rangers immediately using a nearby family's phone. The first team arrived within minutes because a patrol truck had been covering the main road closer than usual. The rangers examined the prints, the surrounding ground, the trunks, and the low brush nearby. No broken branches indicated a fall. No drag marks suggested an animal. The soil stayed soft enough to record the smallest movements, yet nothing else appeared. The search expanded quickly. Volunteers spread across the lower loop while dogs ran the perimeter. The dogs followed Aiden's scent to the cedar trunks, then stopped completely. One dog circled several times, then sat down, confused. The handler said the dog acted as if the scent rose upward or simply vanished into open air. That detail forced the team to slow their assumptions and treat the area like a potential anomaly. Ranger Helene Varick, who led many missing child operations, studied the ground again. She noticed something subtle. Near the place where the footprints stopped, tiny pebbles looked slightly displaced in a fan-shaped pattern, not enough to indicate a slide, but enough to suggest a sharp upward push. She compared that pattern to documented jump landings from other cases, but found no matching example. The pebbles looked scattered outward rather than downward. Half an hour after the search began, Helene ordered a sweep of the creek bank. Though unlikely, kids sometimes slipped silently into water. Teams found no footprints, wet soil, or disturbed moss. They checked the base of the larger trees for climb marks. Nothing indicated that Iden tried scaling anything. The only marks remained the clean sequence of shoe prints that ended too abruptly for a natural explanation. A backpacker named MrBallen approached the rangers with a concerning detail. He said that while hiking an upper ridge earlier that morning, he heard a strange, high-pitched sequence above the tree line. He described it as 3 rapid tones rising slightly each time. He assumed it came from a distant bird until he noticed silence immediately afterward. Seer rarely encountered quiet zones in that forest because birds roosted heavily in the pines. Rangers asked Seer to retrace his path. He guided them to a viewpoint above the campground, where the wind often carried sounds from below. They found nothing useful except an odd resonance near a rock cluster. When Helene tapped one stone lightly with her boot, it produced a faint metallic ring instead of a typical hollow thud. She struck it again and heard only normal stone impact. The ranger noted the anomaly but could not link it directly to Iden's disappearance. As afternoon shifted to evening, the search area widened. Rangers radioed updates and organized people into grids. The families at the campground helped where they could. Mira remained near the cedar trunks, whispering her son's name, refusing to leave the prints behind. She studied the soil repeatedly, trying to make sense of the clean ending. Ren stayed with her and offered quiet support, though he found no words that matched the moment. During the second day, investigators flagged a secondary trail about 50 yards uphill where faint impressions appeared between patches of moss. At first, they hoped these impressions belonged to Iden, but the spacing and shape did not match his known shoe size. These prints looked longer and narrower, with a slight inward tilt at the toe. A biologist later said the impressions did not align with deer, bear, or any known wildlife in the region. Another team discovered an odd patch of bark shavings near a leaning pine tree. The shavings formed a semicircle at the base, as if something pressed against the trunk and scraped downward lightly. Above that semicircle, the bark showed faint vertical streaks, not consistent with claws or boots. Helene measured the streaks and concluded they were too parallel and evenly spaced to be natural. She documented the finding, but could not tie it to the disappearance directly. Late on the second day, a piece of new information arrived from a retired ranger named Tavin Krusk, who recognized the ridge's description. He said that around 20 years earlier, survey workers reported odd echoes near that same bend in the trail, describing them as hollow tones that shifted pitch when people walked past certain stones. Those notes survived in an old binder stored at the ranger station, but were never added to the digital logs. Rangers reviewed the binder that evening. One page described a brief search for a missing hiker in that same general zone. That hiker returned on his own after several hours and refused to explain where he went. He only said the air felt heavy and he lost track of direction near a pair of cedar trunks. When pressed, he repeated that he thought something whispered from inside the branches, though no one else heard it. Armed with the older notes, the team focused again on the 2 cedar trunks. They brought in thermal imaging and checked every cavity. The cameras registered nothing unusual except a brief cold line between the trunks that faded quickly. A technician said the drop might come from wind funneling through a narrow gap, though that gap did not appear visible from any angle. The third morning ended the search effort. A volunteer found a single fresh footprint on a patch of soil near the far edge of the campground. The print looked exactly like Iden's shoe, except for one detail. The heel impression seemed deeper than anything a child of his size should create. It was as if something heavier pressed the shoe shape downward. The print stood alone without any others nearby. Helene studied the odd footprint and recognized the pattern from the first set of tracks. She compared soil density and angle. The new print pressed deeper and cleaner, suggesting downward pressure without forward movement. She documented it carefully, then ordered the grid search to stop. She never gave an official explanation, but told the staff they could not risk pushing the volunteers farther into areas with unstable signals and unexplained footprints. The case closed with undetermined cause and insufficient evidence. Mira stayed near the campground for several days. She visited the cedar trunks each morning and sat silently beside the place where the soil remained smooth. The campground reopened weeks later, though. Visitors occasionally mentioned that the air near the first bend felt unnaturally still. Some claimed they heard faint upward tones during late afternoons, though none recorded them. Rangers do not place signage near that part of the trail anymore. They simply advise families to stay within view of the main clearing. Those who worked the search still remember Mira's quiet calls, the clean ending of the footprints, and the odd pebble pattern that suggested a force moving upward rather than forward. The forest remains calm today, sunlit and peaceful, with families hiking along the same path. Yet the ending point of the footprints stays burned into the memories of everyone who saw them. A child vanished in seconds, but the ground beneath him told a story no one felt ready to understand. Nobody believed the Smoky Mountains warning until the incident. Old hikers use this title when talking about a stretch of trail in the Smokies that locals avoided after dark, and they claimed the warning came from a ridge where maps never fully matched the terrain. They said the park staff heard stories for years, yet dismissed them as campfire myths. Everything changed after one incident that forced officials to review notes they once ignored. The center of the story was a seasonal guide named Brannock Hale who worked part-time while studying forestry. Brannock was 30 and calm under pressure, and he liked the quiet rhythm of early morning trail checks. That day, he planned a simple loop through a popular overlook near the Western Range. He left the visitor center with a thermos and a small radio clipped to his pack. His goal was to confirm storm damage reports before weekend traffic increased, and he expected to be back before noon. The air felt cool and steady as he stepped onto the trail. He spoke with two campers heading downhill, who mentioned hearing a strange whistle pattern during the night. They said it sounded human, but repeated in fixed intervals, which made them uneasy. Brannock smiled and blamed wind shifts or distant wildlife. Locals had warned new guides about odd voices near that ridge for years, yet no ranger ever logged anything concrete. He continued along the trail and felt the sun warm the forest floor. The incident began when he reached a junction where the well-marked path narrowed beside thick brush. A new sign marked a detour from recent storms, yet the paper looked older than expected. The corners had weatherware inconsistent with the last rainfall. He crouched to check the ground and found footprints that repeated in a tight looping pattern. They overlapped too neatly to be natural. He radioed the station, but only received a partial reply that cut mid-sentence. As he moved deeper into the detour, he noticed a faint smell of burnt wood mixed with damp moss. He followed it and found a small clearing with a fire ring that looked recently kicked apart. Beside it lay a single boot print facing the tree line. The depth suggested someone moving quickly. He took a photo and scribbled the direction in his notebook. The surrounding branches looked bent in one direction, as if someone pushed through them moments earlier. The complication became obvious when he heard a short whistle echo from somewhere ahead. It matched the pattern described by the campers. 3 short notes followed by a long one. Brannock stepped forward and saw a scrap of blue fabric snagged on a branch. It looked like part of a lightweight hiking jacket. He reached for his radio and said, "I have signs of an active hiker off trail," and waited for a response. Only wind crossed the channel. Brannock followed the fabric trail toward a narrow slope. The ground slanted into a shallow ravine where the soil looked freshly overturned. A broken trekking pole lay half buried near a rock. The fracture marks appeared clean, as though bent under heavy pressure. He picked it up and saw faint letters scratched on the handle that read "Turn back." The words looked rushed and uneven. His pulse quickened as he scanned the area for movement. A faint cracking sound echoed behind him. He turned quickly and saw no one. The forest remained still. He walked along the ravine and found a line of stones arranged in a curved pattern. They looked intentionally placed. At the center of the curve, he spotted a trail marker with the number 6 carved deeply into the wood. The current map did not list any marker with that number on this side of the ridge. He photographed it and moved toward higher ground. The investigation deepened when he climbed onto a ridge shelf and saw a second fabric scrap caught on a thorn. He noticed long drag marks in the dirt that led toward a cluster of trees. The marks looked like someone pulled a heavy pack or tried to crawl with limited strength. He called out, and his voice bounced oddly between the trunks. The echo arrived a fraction late, as if the sound traveled through a narrow chamber before returning. Brannick reached a tree with thick roots curling above ground. Beneath one root, he found a small metal whistle with dents across its surface. It matched the style sold at the visitor center. He blew on it lightly to test airflow. No sound emerged. He pocketed it and scanned the slope for any sign of the missing hiker. He approached a rock ledge and paused when he heard a faint voice calling from below. The voice sounded muffled and strained. It repeated a short phrase that he could not fully understand. He knelt near the edge and called, "Hello, can you move toward my voice?" But the reply sounded distant. He grabbed his rope from his pack and anchored it to a nearby tree. As he prepared to descend, he heard rustling behind him again. This time, it sounded like slow, deliberate steps. Brannick turned and saw fresh prints appearing in the soft dirt leading directly toward him. They formed in steady intervals as if made by someone walking, yet no figure stood nearby. He felt the air tighten and backed up slowly. He radioed the station with more urgency and said, "Something is wrong on the ridge. I need support now." But the signal faded under a wave of static. He clipped the rope to his harness and prepared to descend anyway. He lowered himself a few feet before stopping. The voice below repeated the same strained pattern. It sounded oddly rhythmic now. He called, "Can you yell your name?" And the reply matched his exact tone but repeated the word name in a distorted echo. Brannick froze as he realized the voice did not belong to a trapped hiker. It copied him perfectly, except for an uneven quality buried under the sound. He climbed back up and scanned the ridge. The forest felt unnaturally still. The prints behind him shifted direction. They now pointed toward the ravine rather than the ledge. He followed them with careful steps and felt an uneasy pressure on his chest. He reached the curved stone pattern again and noticed something new. His own boot prints from earlier had been moved into a mirrored line beside the original tracks. The twist settled over him when he replayed the last radio message on his device. He heard the same static crackle interrupted by a second faint voice buried inside the channel. It repeated a few of his words as though trying to match his speech. The pitch fluctuated in a way that did not sound mechanical. It sounded closer to a person standing near the microphone. His skin tightened. The ridge felt too quiet. Brannick stepped backward and nearly tripped over a pack covered in pine needles. It belonged to a missing hiker reported earlier that month. Inside, he found a water bottle, a torn map, and a whistle identical to the one he pocketed. A note jammed into the side pocket read it copies who it sees, and the handwriting slanted downward. The message looked rushed and uneven. Brannick tried to radio again, but the device only emitted a rising static tone. He ran toward the main trail as branches cracked far behind him with steady intervals. Each crack matched his footsteps with a slight delay. He reached the junction and stopped when he saw a figure standing near the overlook rail. The figure did not move. Brannick raised his radio and called out. The figure shifted and took one slow step forward. He saw no face details. The figure matched his stance exactly. He backed away and slid down the slope toward the main road where a patrol vehicle waited. Two rangers rushed toward him as he waved them down. They helped him into the truck and drove quickly to the station. When they reviewed his radio recordings, they heard not only his words, but a second layered voice repeating fragmented versions. The final seconds captured a phrase neither ranger could explain. It whispered his name with a broken, uneven tone. The button came when officials closed the detour permanently and removed all temporary signs. Rangers placed new warnings at the trailhead, though they never described the full details publicly. They said the Smoky Mountains held pockets of strange echoes from the terrain, yet Brannick insisted it was something else. People still hike that ridge, but staff tell newcomers to ignore whistles that repeat in fixed intervals. They say the mountain returns sounds that never belonged to the wind. The case that made an entire rescue team quit overnight. A widely shared account claims an entire mountain rescue crew quit after one call, and archived reports support several parts. The details are fractured across notes and dispatch summaries, yet the core sequence has remained consistent for many years. In early autumn, a ranger named Calder Rusk prepared for a routine sweep near an old service trail that cut across a remote ridge. He was 39 with a steady record in backcountry safety work. His plan for that day was simple: reach a repeater station, log maintenance photos, and return before night dropped into the valley. The problem started when his radio received a broken call from two hikers who reported seeing someone waving from a ledge near a ravine. Their message kept cutting out, and only the final part reached dispatch clearly. The hikers said the figure looked injured and possibly trapped. Calder changed direction immediately and started toward the ridge where the hikers claimed the figure had appeared. Wind pushed hard through the tree line, and visibility dropped each time. Loose soil drifted off the cliffs. Calder tried raising the hikers again, but only caught static and a few clipped words. He marked their last known coordinates on his map and continued moving until he reached the overlook where the signal last held. He found no hikers and no sign of anyone waving. The only thing he noticed was a narrow scrape in the dirt that looked like a heel sliding downslope. He followed it for a short distance, but stopped when the ground turned soft near the ravine walls. He reported uncertain conditions, and dispatch called in a full rescue unit from a nearby station that handled technical extractions. The team arrived with a lead tech named Varen Hale, age 34, who had spent more than a decade on rope operations. Varen set anchors while two climbers lowered a drone to check the ledges below. The drone camera showed brush movement that looked too steady to be wind. It rose as if pulled, then dropped again with an odd rhythm that bothered the technicians watching the feed. One climber, named Ren Gorley, volunteered to descend first. He worked slowly, checking every point on the wall, and called out distances to Varen. Ren stopped when he noticed strands of fabric caught on a broken branch. The color matched what the hikers reported earlier. Ren clipped the fabric into a pouch and kept moving until he reached the ledge where someone had been seen. The ledge was larger than expected and held an old survey stake driven deep into the stone. Ren called for a second climber to assist when he found what looked like a torn pack beside the stake. Both rescuers examined it carefully. There were rope burns across the outer flap and residue that looked like old chalk dust. Ren radioed that the pack seemed abandoned for years and did not match current models. Calder checked earlier lost hiker reports and found a record from late 2009 that mentioned a missing climber near the same ridge. The case ended without recovery because weather destroyed search corridors within 2 days. The report stated the climber was last seen moving toward a service trail used decades earlier for equipment hauls. None of the teams at that time reached the ravine zone due to landslides. When Ren repositioned his light, he saw a narrow tunnel-like cut behind the ledge that did not appear in any old maps. The opening was irregular and seemed carved by runoff, yet the edges looked polished as if worn by repeated contact. He leaned inside and caught a whiff of stale air with a sharp mineral scent. He asked Varen for permission to briefly check inside. Varen hesitated, then allowed a minimal probe. Ren crawled a short distance until his light caught something reflective. It was a cracked visor from a helmet that matched the missing climber report from 2009. The visor rested beside a small recorder, still mostly intact. Ren backed out carefully and handed the items up the line. Technicians inspected the recorder and found the battery swollen but not leaked. They bagged it for later review. While Ren prepared to climb up, the ledge vibrated slightly. He reported the movement and asked if any anchors had shifted. Varen confirmed all gear held firm. Ren said the vibration felt more like pressure from behind the wall rather than movement from rope tension. He asked to finish the ascent quickly. As he climbed, the drone camera captured a motion blur inside the tunnel that looked like a sudden retreat of something thin and tall. The team went silent as they reviewed the frame. No one could agree whether it showed an animal or a trick of low light. Calder suggested pulling everyone back until they could analyze the footage. Varen agreed and ordered a full extraction of all climbers and gear. Ren climbed in fast bursts, and the second climber followed him immediately. On the final pull, Ren shouted that the ledge was shifting downward. His voice shook as he said the ground felt like it was pulsing. Varen and two others hauled the rope with everything they had until Ren reached the top. The ledge collapsed minutes later and sent a sheet of stone and soil into the ravine. The collapse exposed a longer cavity behind the old tunnel cut, though no one stayed near enough to inspect it safely. Back at the station, the recorder from the tunnel was dried and cleaned. Audio specialists retrieved a single file with several minutes of sound. The first part held wind noise and climbing calls. The last part caught a higher-pitched voice, saying something about footsteps that did not echo properly. The climber sounded confused and whispered that lights kept flickering below the ledge even though no one carried a headlamp. The final seconds held a scraping tone that rose sharply before the file cut. The note review marked it as unknown environmental sound. Varen stopped the playback halfway and stepped out of the room. Wren asked for the file to be paused and requested that dispatch notify the Park Service about the newly exposed cavity. Calder wrote a brief incident summary and noted that the hikers who made the first call never identified themselves and never filed a follow-up report. The department reviewed the operation 2 weeks later. Every member of the rope team submitted resignations within the same night. Their statements cited unsafe geological conditions and unresolved safety concerns near the ravine. Internal sources claimed several team members refused to discuss the drone frame or the vibration Wren felt on the ledge. The station chief sealed the file, pending a geological assessment that never fully concluded. Calder stayed with the service but avoided that ridge for the remainder of his contract. He later told colleagues that the case felt incomplete because none of the core questions were answered. The hikers vanished. The tunnel extended deeper than any map showed. The recorder held a sound no one could classify. Years later, the ridge remains restricted under a risk notice that rarely appears on public maps. Local staff still mention the night an entire rescue team walked away from their careers after one call that began with a simple report of a figure waving from a ledge. The unexplainable trail cam footage found after the hikers vanished. A set of trail cam photos linked to a missing hiker's case became the most debated evidence in a quiet mountain region. Rangers said the images did not match typical wildlife behavior reported in that part of the country. Locals claimed the ridge where the shots were taken was known for strange echoes and sudden temperature drops during late autumn. Arlen Cade was a 34-year-old field technician who repaired communication towers across rural areas. He spent most weekends hiking remote trails to scout new climbs and escape his long days on the road. On a mild morning in early November, he met two acquaintances named Risa DeVell and Bram Teller at the trailhead of a state-managed forest known mostly to hunters and survey teams. They planned a simple overnight loop across an older fire road that connected to a ridge rarely shown on public maps. Arlen hoped to photograph a line of abandoned towers listed in an archived maintenance report from 2009. They expected an easy first day with steady weather and clear visibility. The ridge path had enough markers to keep their route predictable. Arlen carried a compact emergency beacon in case their phones lost service. Risa packed extra water and a lightweight stove. Bram hauled a basic first aid kit and a set of climbing gloves he swore brought luck during rough trips. The group entered the woods just before noon, while another hiker returning from a morning run waved and mentioned hearing distant metallic clanking near the upper switchbacks. They laughed it off and kept moving. Shortly after reaching the halfway point, Arlen noticed a thin mist drifting across the trail from the low side of the slope. It moved against the breeze and held a strange blue tint when hit by sunlight. Risa pointed out that the air smelled faintly like ozone during thunderstorms, even though the sky was perfectly clear. Bram suggested it might come from an unseen creek running below the trail. They shrugged and continued, despite feeling slightly uneasy. Late that afternoon, the group reached the old fire road and decided to set camp near a fallen tower foundation described in Arlen's documents. He located a cracked concrete pad with rusted bolts still rising from the surface. Nearby, he saw a small metal bracket nailed to a cedar trunk. It looked like part of a retired monitoring setup. He guessed a ranger might have used it for weather sensors during the early 2000s. Risa snapped a picture while Bram inspected the ground for a location to pitch the tent. As evening settled, they cooked a quick meal, then heard a sudden crack echo across the ridge. Arlen grabbed a flashlight and scanned the tree line. The beam landed on a narrow shape standing at an angle behind two clustered pines. The shape lowered as if reacting to the light, then vanished with a quiet whipping sound. Bram joked it might be a deer startled by the sudden brightness. Risa frowned because the shape seemed too thin and tall. They agreed not to chase it and stayed close to camp. They turned in around 10 and slept lightly under the steady wind. By morning, the camp looked undisturbed except for faint drag marks near the edge of the concrete pad. Arlen thought they could be from shifting gear, but Risa insisted none of them walked that path overnight. Bram shrugged and said it probably did not matter. They packed their supplies and prepared to continue toward the ridge crest. A distant rumble rolled through the valley, though the forecast predicted clear skies. They checked the beacon, which still showed adequate battery. The group stepped onto the fire road and began the last climb. When Arlen's sister reported them overdue 2 days later, rangers launched a search. Their car remained at the trailhead untouched, and weather conditions stayed stable during the entire period. Search teams found no immediate signs of distress along the marked path. Rangers expected to locate footprints or scattered gear, but found nothing except a stove lid near the fallen tower site. A rescue dog paused near the concrete pad, then circled twice before whining and walking away. The team marked the area and continued scanning the ridge. A week into the search, a ranger named Talon Rusk retrieved footage from a remote trail cam mounted higher on the ridge. The device aimed toward a narrow clearing well above the fire road and was usually checked only during early winter. Talon wired the memory card to a laptop and opened the most recent folder. He expected images of deer or stray hikers. Instead, he found a sequence shot during the night. Arlen's group camped near the fallen foundation. The first image showed 3 figures standing near the clearing. Their outlines matched Arlen's reported group, though the height ratios seemed slightly off. One figure stood too far forward with its shoulders tilted at an unnatural angle. The next image, time-stamped only 2 minutes later, showed the same clearing empty except for a thin streak of white light curved like a filament in the air. Talon studied the pixels and thought it resembled a reflection, but could not identify any obvious source. Another image captured a tall shape at the far edge of the frame. It appeared narrower than a human and stood completely still. When magnified, the pixels formed a faint grid pattern across the torso as if the shape reflected a distant structure. Talon checked the device's lens for smudges, yet found nothing. He printed the images for the main team and hiked down to the command tent. Investigators compared the silhouettes in the first photo with earlier pictures from Arlen's phone collected from his home computer. 2 shapes resembled Arlen and Bram, but the third looked different from Risa's known height and posture. Her family insisted she never wore long reflective strips on her jacket, yet the figure in the frame had bright bands across both wrists. The team noted that none of them packed reflective gear during their departure based on their own packing lists. The next step involved analyzing the white filament captured in the second image. A technician believed the streak indicated a rapid light movement from ground level to midframe. He suggested it might be a firefly caught during a long exposure. Another analyst argued the camera did not support that type of shutter behavior, and the streak seemed too uniform to be an insect artifact. They flagged the sequence for deeper review. While comparing timestamps, a ranger realized the tall shape in the third frame lined up with the approximate position of the fallen tower foundation. The shape's faint grid pattern could match a broken support brace from the decommissioned structure. However, the brace did not stand upright when the site was surveyed earlier. Investigators considered the possibility of shadows cast by a flashlight beam from a passing hiker, but no one reported being on the ridge during that night. 3 days later, search teams discovered Arlen's beacon lodged under a root system near a narrow runoff creek. The device had no fractures and the batteries still held a charge. Its log showed no emergency activation. The position did not match any logical route the group would have taken. A boot print found nearby did not match any of their known sizes and faced directly toward the upper clearing. Investigators returned to the trail cam location to recreate the angles. They realized the lens captured part of a second clearing not visible from any main path. A shallow trench cut through the leaves and led down a slope toward an unmarked service road listed only in an old maintenance ledger from 2006. The ledger described brief equipment tests conducted by a private contractor whose name was partly unreadable due to water damage. A final review of the photos produced one more unsettling detail. In the first image, the forward-standing figure cast a shadow that did not align with the moon position recorded that night. The shadow stretched toward the camera rather than away from it. Analysts compared cloud data and terrain slope but could not produce a clear explanation. The official report stated the shadow anomaly was likely caused by overlapping light sources, though no secondary light source was documented. The case remained open after months of intermittent searches. Hikers who passed through the area claimed the ridge felt unusually silent and avoided camping near the old foundation. Talon kept the printed photos locked in a desk drawer at the ranger station and occasionally reviewed them during paperwork nights. He believed the images captured something moving through the ridge that did not belong there. He never reached a firm conclusion, but accepted that the terrain sometimes produced effects that defied simple explanations. The trail cam was eventually removed for routine updates. Some rangers said the device drained its batteries faster than expected during cold months. Others said the memory card occasionally saved blank frames during windy nights. None of these issues offered useful leads. Locals continued to debate the white filament and the forward-standing figure seen in the photos. Arlen's family held hope that new information might emerge, though nothing substantial ever surfaced. In quiet moments, Talon recalled the clearing shown in the photos. He felt the ridge held something older than the abandoned tower lines, and believed the group stepped into a pocket of terrain shaped by forces rarely observed. The mountain remained open to hikers, and the trail stayed on the official map. Still, many who heard the story chose easier routes and avoided the ridge after dusk. The unanswered details of the footage remained a quiet reminder that certain places resist full explanation even after careful investigation. He shouldn't have opened that door. The officers found out why. The officers who handled the welfare check still talk about that night quietly, usually when the station hallways grow empty. Their report labels it as a routine entry with no suspects found. Yet the body camera audio tells a different story entirely. At the center of it was Kellen Dorse, 34, a warehouse night shift worker who rented a small duplex near a noisy highway. He lived alone, kept to himself, and rarely caused trouble, the kind of tenant landlords usually trust to pay on time without questions. For months, Kellen told friends he barely noticed the locked door at the end of his hallway, a door his landlord said was storage only. It was painted flat white, had an old latch, and sat slightly crooked, like the frame had shifted long ago when the duplex settled awkwardly. He passed it every day on the way to the bathroom, thinking nothing of it, just another leftover feature from previous owners. He had no reason to care about it until the knocking started during the late autumn rainstorms around 2020. The first knock came when he had just returned from work, half asleep, microwaving leftover noodles while lightning flashed outside. It was 3 sharp hits from deep inside the hallway, too precise to be the building settling, too centered to belong to the neighbors next door. Kellen set down the fork, confused, then walked slowly toward the sound, feeling the air grow cooler with each step he took. At the end of the hallway, the locked door stood still. No movement, no rattling, nothing except faint drafts from the old ceiling vent. He pressed his ear to the wood, expecting a radio or the dull hum of pipes, but he only heard the distant rush of cars on the highway. Later, he convinced himself it was nothing, telling his coworker the building must have shifted under the heavy wind and cold rain that week. Yet he kept glancing at the door whenever he passed, noticing how the paint around the latch had tiny cracks shaped like scratches. A few days after that first incident, the knocking returned, soft at first, then louder, like someone trying different rhythms deliberately. This time, he set his phone on the hallway floor, recording a voice memo while he sat in the bedroom pretending to ignore the whole thing. 20 minutes passed before the knocking came again. 2 knocks, then a pause, then one higher knock, as if from someone standing taller. When Kellen listened to the recording, the knocks sounded clearer than he expected, hollow and too close, like they came from the phone itself. Right between the second and third knock, another sound appeared, a soft rasp that formed 4 recognizable words very quickly. "Do not open that," it said, the voice low and strange, neither loud nor whispering, but spoken right beside the microphone somehow. Kellen replayed the audio again and again, each time feeling his skin tighten, because the timing and tone never changed at all. He knew audio glitches could mimic words, yet this did not bend like static, it snapped into place as clean speech every single time. He saved the file anyway, telling himself he would delete it later when he stopped imagining voices inside walls that nobody else heard. The situation escalated near early winter, when heavy rain flooded the roof and forced the landlord to send a repairman to patch it. While fixing the leak, the repairman kept glancing down the hallway toward the locked door, his eyes lingering there longer than normal. Before leaving, he asked Kellen quietly if the door ever caused trouble, then added that some rooms stayed closed for good reasons. He said it calmly, but his tone carried something like caution, and that stuck with Kellen long after the dripping bucket disappeared. By late week, Kellen's coworkers noticed he looked pale and distracted, unable to focus through an entire shift without drifting. He claimed he was losing sleep, waking often to faint knocks at the same time every night, always coming from the locked door. The voice returned as well, repeating itself more frequently, always telling him the same thing in a tone that sounded tired and insistent. On the last night, before everything unraveled, he said the hallway felt strange, the air heavy, like someone waited behind the door. He remembered sitting with his back against the locked door, whispering promises into the wood that he would not open it. He said he told whatever listened that he understood the rule, that he would keep the hallway quiet, that nothing needed to change. He could not explain why he felt compelled to say any of it, only that he sensed something, listening with patient attention. After that moment, his memory blurred, as if hours vanished, leaving him floating through fragments he could not place cleanly. 3 days later, when he missed too many shifts, the landlord called for a welfare check, unlocking the duplex for responding officers. Officer Deacon Ruiz and Officer Carla Havers stepped inside first, their body cameras recording the dim living room and cold kitchen counters. Nothing looked severely disturbed, though clutter and half-eaten food suggested someone stopped caring about routine tasks suddenly. The officers called Kellen's name, moving slowly through each room until they reached the end of the hallway and saw the locked door. The landlord insisted he had no key for that latch anymore, claiming the door had been sealed long before he bought the duplex. Ruiz tried the handle anyway, finding it locked and slightly cold, the paint feeling gritty under his fingertips from old scraped marks. He noticed faint arcs near the latch, small curved scratches that looked as if pressure had pushed outward repeatedly from inside. With a missing tenant and a locked room, they radioed for permission to force entry, which dispatch approved after a brief pause. The body camera audio captured everything when Ruiz braced himself and hit the door near the latch with his shoulder. The first hit shook dust from the frame, drifting down in pale streaks caught by the hallway light, but the door barely moved. The second hit made the hinges creak sharply, and a noise leaked from somewhere beyond the door, soft and low, not quite a voice. Both officers hesitated, sharing a quick look, then Ruiz struck the door a third time, breaking the frame and forcing it open completely. Behind it was not a storage room, but a cramped enclosed space, barely larger than a closet, with no windows and stale heavy air. A thin mattress lay on the floor, twisted, with dark stains forming uneven shapes near the center that no one could immediately identify. Tall, vertical lines were painted along one wall, each line slightly uneven, with numbers scratched beneath them in descending order. In the far corner, illuminated by the hallway light, sat Kellen, knees drawn up, eyes wide, staring at the officers without blinking. He did not respond when they called his name, only shifting his gaze slowly toward the broken frame and the splintered latch. When Ruiz touched his shoulder, Kellen finally spoke, voice raw, like he had spent long hours whispering in that cramped room. "You opened it," he murmured, barely audible, yet both officers heard him clearly as the body microphones captured every word. "I told it I would not. I told it nobody else would. That was the deal. That was the only rule that mattered." Paramedics said later that his vitals looked like those of someone extremely sleep-deprived and dehydrated, yet untouched by violence. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, he resisted at first, not attacking, only trying to stay in the corner like leaving would break something further. He repeated the same phrase again and again, saying the knocking had been a warning, saying the voice had been protecting him from the rule. On the footage, as they carried him down the hallway, he whispered something else, asking if someone still waited behind the door. Investigators examined the small room thoroughly, cataloging the painted lines, the scratched numbers, and the strange stains on the mattress. Lab reports later revealed biological traces belonging to multiple unknown individuals, none matching Kellen, some decades older than the duplex. The numbers under the lines followed a pattern nobody could decode, though one of them matched the final digits of Kellen's employee badge. The audio file from his phone was analyzed as well, and the experts concluded the voice did not match any known interference pattern. Their report stated that the signal appeared impossibly close to the microphone without any buildup, then vanished instantly without trailing noise. It noted that the phrase remained identical even when slowed or filtered, lacking natural variations that human speech normally carries. They labeled it anomalous audio of undetermined origin, the safest language for something they could not classify cleanly. Kellen told hospital staff that the voice had grown desperate in the final hours, repeating its warning constantly, begging him to keep the rule. He said the knocking had stopped entirely right before the officers arrived, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like the house held its breath. He remembered promising again that he would not open the door, that he understood the importance of leaving it shut no matter what. He had no memory of moving into the cramped room, only the sense that he needed to sit there, as if fulfilling something asked of him quietly. He realized the officers broke the rule, not him, and that thought seemed to disturb him more than anything that happened inside the duplex. When Officer Havers later reviewed the body camera footage alone, she heard something she had not noticed the first time. Right after Ruiz hit the door the second time, buried under the wood cracking, a faint rasp whispered from no clear direction. It repeated the same 4 words captured on Kellen's phone, spoken faster and more urgently, as if reacting to the impact. "Do not open that," it said, the tone rising slightly, not angry, but pleading, like a final attempt to stop what happened next. She saved that clip privately, though she did not emphasize it in the official summary, knowing nobody could explain it properly. The duplex was renovated later, the interior walls reconfigured, the small room removed, the landlord insisting it would prevent future issues. A contractor told someone off the record that the framing inside the wall did not match the rest of the building, like the room predated it. Nobody could find earlier records showing who built it or why, only vague references to an older structure on the property decades earlier. Kellen eventually moved away and refused to rent any place with locked interior doors again, telling doctors he still heard faint knocking sometimes. He claimed it happened around the same hour every night. Not loud, not demanding, just a quiet reminder of the rule that no longer existed. The officers who worked the case still avoid talking about the locked room in detail, each of them remembering the cold air inside it. They say the strangest part was not the room or the numbers or the stains, but the sense that something waited for them to break the rule. In the end, the official conclusion stayed simple, listing no suspects, no crime, and no ongoing danger, only a tenant in distress. Unofficially, the people who were there believe Kellen kept a promise he never understood, one that nobody else should have interfered with. They think the voice behind the door had followed its own rule for years, counting on someone to leave the lock untouched. And when Ruiz forced that door open, they learned why some warnings are meant to be obeyed, no matter how strange they sound. He shouldn't have followed the footprints, but he did. Archive notes from a small county office mention a deputy who changed after a winter call near an abandoned campground. His name was Rylan Keever, 38 years old, known for calm work and long quiet shifts. His assignment that evening sounded simple. Watch the closed road, check the locked gate, and make sure no one tried to camp in restricted areas. Snow covered the valley in a thin sheet that softened every sound except the wind. Rylan parked a cruiser near the gate and listened to the steady tick of cooling metal. He had expected a slow night with no real trouble, just a routine check to earn extra pay before roads iced deeper along the ridge. Near 9, he stepped out to stretch and used his light to scan the road. The gate stood solid. No tracks touched the chain or the padlock. As he turned back toward the cruiser, he saw something darker pressed into the snow only a few feet away. At first, he thought it was animal movement, but the shapes had clear toes and a defined arch. They were footprints. Bare ones. And fresh enough that the snow around them still held a slight shine from recent pressure. Rylan checked behind him and saw no approaching trail. No path from the highway, no scuffs beside the ditch. The first print began in the middle of the road as if someone had appeared there and walked calmly toward the forest. each step spaced evenly, with no sign of panic or limping through cold that should have shredded unprotected skin. He radioed dispatch and said he would check possible foot traffic near the gate. The dispatcher asked if he needed backup. Rylan answered that he probably did not and just wanted to confirm no one was hurt. Those were the moments when he should have stopped, marked the location, and waited. Instead, he squeezed through the gate and followed the prince into the trees. The forest grew darker with each step, and wind pressed branches against one another in slow groans. Rylan kept his light low and tried to stay calm. The prince never drifted aside or hesitated near roots or fallen logs. They traveled straight as if the person moved through obstacles without adjusting course, something that bothered him more than the cold. After several minutes, he reached a clearing he recognized from old maps. An out-of-service pump house sat near a bend in the slope. County files said it had been boarded for years and was scheduled for demolition long ago. The prince led right to its door and stopped at the threshold, toes almost touching the wood. No return prints, no scatter of snow that showed hesitation. He checked the door and found no gap large enough for anyone to slip through. Metal sealed the bottom, paint flaked along the sides, and frost collected near the edges. He knocked and called out. No answer. Just the faint pulse of air behind the boards, like a slow, rhythmic shift coming from somewhere deeper underground. Rylan circled the building. The windows had thick plywood, all aged and unbroken. At the rear corner, he saw a metal tag tacked to the siding. The number format looked like the catalog codes maintenance crews used years before. He snapped a picture and sent it to a coworker who handled records. Then he pressed his ear against the wall again. What he heard unsettled him more than the footprints. A steady vibration timed too neatly to be wind. A low throb like buried machinery that had no business being active in a dead building. He stepped back, reported a possible trapped person, and waited for a response. Snow built thicker around his boots as silence returned. His phone buzzed. The coworker replied that the pump house in his photo should not exist. Records showed a demolition order completed 5 years earlier with photo proof of an empty concrete pad. Rylan requested the file. The archived picture arrived moments later. It showed the same slope and tree line, but no building, only a cracked foundation. He compared the image with what stood before him. Every tree matched, every ridge matched, only the structure differed. He recorded video for evidence and checked the footprints again. They held their shape too sharply for the falling snow, as if the flakes avoided the depressions. Headlights appeared through the storm as his supervisor arrived. Sergeant Lyle Hargan listened to the summary without comment. He suggested records often lost track of old buildings, and kids sometimes ran barefoot as a dare. Rylan wanted to argue, but knew Lyle would not entertain theories that sounded strange. They forced the door open. Inside, they found rusted pipes, a cracked basin filled with dark water, and thick dust-coating old fixtures. No sign of occupation. But the vibration grew stronger near the basin with a steady pulse that felt wrong under their boots. Lyle dismissed it as leftover pressure somewhere down the line. He logged the structure for evaluation and called the scene cleared. Rylan went home uneasy. Later that night, he replayed the brief interference his radio had captured before Lyle arrived. A thin voice, young and strained, repeated a phrase that stuck with him long after he removed his earbuds. They were not done counting. Dispatch insisted no one transmitted at that moment. Sleep came in short bursts over the next days. Rylan dreamed of rows of bare footprints leading toward the pump house, each set perfectly spaced, each one vanishing at the door. He researched the old missing person cases again, remembering a teenager from 2011 who had vanished barefoot near the same road. The boy had been obsessed with numbers and patterns, often complaining when counts seemed wrong. The last witness statement before his disappearance mentioned he had been worried about the pump station records. He claimed something on the map did not match what he saw near the campground, but no one listened at the time. Rylan returned to the site twice on his own. The building stayed where it stood that night, solid and weathered. Snow around it showed only animal prints and a few maintenance truck tracks. Yet each time he approached the foundation, he felt the same low pulse under the ground. When the county demolition crew finally came with full equipment and verification, fog covered the valley. They reached the clearing and found only the original concrete slab shown in the old photo. No pump house, no boards, no basin, no carved initials, nothing but cracked cement and brittle weeds. Ryland stood at the edge of the pad, confused and shaken. His videos still showed the structure. The radio log still held the voice. The prints he followed still appeared in his gallery. Yet the clearing now matched the demolition picture exactly. He visited one final time near dusk a week later. A thin dusting of snow lay across the slab. In the center stood a single line of bare footprints, each impression neat and coldly defined. They walked from the middle of the pad toward the woods. No prints led inward. He wiped the tracks away with his boot before anyone else could see them. That night, the counting returned in his dreams, quiet but close, and he resigned soon after. The county files marked the case as environmental error and miscommunication. But Ryland still avoids that valley and the road where the prints began in fresh, untouched snow. He knows he should have turned back when he first saw them. He should not have followed the footprints, but he did, and something followed him longer than the trail in the trees. This terrifying recording made the search team walk away. Rangers in the area had dealt with missing hikers before, but none of their cases ever included a recording that made trained rescuers step back in fear. That detail became the first thing investigators noted when the report surfaced. It was tied to a search that took place near an old service trail that sat several miles from the nearest paved road. Calvin Dre, a 34-year-old part-time surveyor, had been out there in late autumn working on boundary updates for a small land office. His goal was simple that morning. He planned to map a narrow ridge, mark a few flagged points, then reach his truck before sunset. He texted a coworker hours later saying the ridge felt off and that he kept hearing something that echoed strangely behind him. He did not send anything else after that. His company contacted local authorities when he did not return that night. A ranger named Isla Rourke led the initial sweep and found Calvin's truck parked neatly beside the old gate with his clipboard still inside. The first odd detail came from a pair of faint tracks that curved away from the marked trail. They looked hurried, yet strangely consistent, as if he kept pacing or circling before heading deeper into the brush. A volunteer named Saren Wade discovered a dropped handheld recorder early the next morning. Calvin often used it to make field notes for clients. The device was cracked but still usable, which made the team hopeful that it held something helpful. Saren replayed the final file and called Isla over within seconds. She said the tone made her chest tighten even before she understood the words. The recording started with wind pushing through the trees. Then Calvin whispered about seeing a figure crouched far down the slope. He said it moved in a way he could not fully describe. The next portion contained a sharp impact. Then, Calvin rushed a sentence about someone answering him from the trees, though he claimed he had not spoken aloud. Hila replayed that part several times and said she heard a second voice that sounded close yet distorted by the wind. Calvin shouted that he needed to leave, then the audio cut abruptly. Isla's team followed the directions suggested by the sound of his final breaths and found broken branches that lined a narrow run of rock shelves. One shelf held a smear of fabric that matched Calvin's jacket. Another shelf carried scuff marks shaped like hesitant foot placements. A third shelf held something stranger. It showed the imprint of a bare foot in cold dirt, yet the size was far larger than any adult's. Saren measured it with a small ruler and stepped back quickly when she realized it stretched nearly twice her length from heel to toe. They radioed for a second team once they reached the base of the slope and found a half-collapsed drainage tunnel. Inside sat more foot imprints arranged in a tight pattern that suggested pacing. Some prints overlapped Calvin's boot marks in a way that made Isla believe he had been cornered or trapped there for several minutes. The team kept finding scratch marks on the tunnel walls and noted that several deep grooves aligned at shoulder height, as if something tall had braced itself before turning sharply. Hila called in a specialist named Tranen Voss, a 37-year-old tracking consultant who often assisted on remote rescues. Tranen examined the tunnel and whispered that none of the marks matched known animal behavior in that region. He collected soil samples and photographed the prints while repeating that the stride patterns made no natural sense. He pointed toward a final trail of disturbed leaves that stretched away from the tunnel and said it looked like two bodies had moved together for a short distance. They followed that disturbance until it reached a dry creek bed. There, they found a metallic smell lingering in the cold air. Isla crouched and pointed to a torn strap from Calvin's field pack. Trannon walked ahead and found another item he could not easily explain. It was a small digital timer, still running, with its casing scratched by what looked like curved metal. He guessed Calvin might have used it as a marker or a signal, though he could not understand why it was left running. The creek bed ended near a stand of taller trees where the brush thickened sharply. Trannon noticed that the ground seemed cleared in a long, narrow line. He said it was as if something had dragged a heavy object while walking in complete straightness without stopping. Isla traced the line for several yards and found more fabric from Calvin's clothes, though no signs of injury appeared on the pieces. They searched through the afternoon and prepared to widen their grid before nightfall. Right as daylight thinned, Saren found a second audio device wedged under a fallen branch. It was not part of Calvin's usual gear. The device looked older and carried faint etchings along its spine that neither Isla nor Trannon recognized. They held it carefully, then managed to play the final stored file. A distant breathing sound filled the speaker and pulsed in slow, irregular intervals. Then a low humming tone built gradually, as if something were inhaling with long pauses. After that, the recording caught Calvin's voice, calling for help with trembling desperation. He asked why the thing kept repeating his words in a quiet, strained whisper. The mimicry, captured in the audio, terrified the search team so deeply that they stepped away from the device at almost the same moment. None of them wanted to play the rest of the file in the fading light. They carried it out of the woods and submitted it to technical staff, who later stated that the final section did not contain human speech patterns. They said it held layered frequencies that suggested an artificial modulation caused by environmental echo. That explanation did little to calm Isla or her team. Authorities kept searching for several days, but never found Calvin or any additional evidence beyond scattered gear. Trannon filed a final note stating that no known animal or environmental factor could account for the overlapping tracks or the strange vocal distortions heard on the recordings. His closing line said the search ended once investigators realized the tunnel markings seemed drawn toward the entrance rather than away from it. People in the region still mention the case in cautious tones. Some hikers say the forest holds pockets of air that carry strange echoes, while others believe Calvin witnessed something no one was prepared to understand. Isla ended her last briefing with a simple statement that the team walked away because they trusted the fear they heard in that recording. She believed that fear meant something waited deeper in the trees, and that leaving the area preserved more lives than staying. An unexplainable sound captured inside their locked cabin. The recording still exists in a shared folder on a small-town deputy's computer, labeled only as Cabin Audio Winter Night. On that audio, a man and a woman whisper about a noise inside their locked cabin. Then something answers from the dark. The couple were Rowan Pike and Eliza Caro, both in their early 30s, living in a rented lakeside cabin for one quiet week. Rowan was 32, an overworked automotive technician from a Midwestern city, and Eliza was 31, a pediatric nurse. They had taken time off together after a rough stretch at the hospital, wanting a place without sirens, neighbors, or bright parking lot lights. The cabin sat at the end of an unplowed road, with forest pressing tight on every side and a narrow frozen lake. It happened in late winter, sometime around 2021, according to later reports, when the lake ice had stopped groaning every night. The cabin belonged to a retired school counselor who rented it out occasionally, insisting every guest sign a very detailed checklist agreement. One item on that checklist stood out even before anything strange happened, and both of them joked about it at first that day. It required guests to keep a small battery recorder running each night in the main room, facing the interior, pointed away from the windows. The owner said the recorder was for liability, in case drunken hunters broke in or a guest tried to blame damage on intruders. Rowan had shrugged, saying it was weird but harmless, and Eliza just flipped the recorder on, watching its tiny red light blink patiently. They spent the first day unpacking, stacking their groceries in the narrow kitchenette, and lighting the wood stove that smelled slightly of pine. The only neighbors were a boarded-up bait shop near the highway and a ranger station across the lake, dark and shuttered for the season. Snow had fallen on and off all day, dulling every sound from the trees until the cabin seemed wrapped in layers of old heavy blankets. By 8 that evening, their phones had dropped service altogether, and the little cabin felt separated from everything they normally worried about. They ate boxed pasta at the wobbly table, listening to a portable speaker playing soft music, then washed dishes slowly in lukewarm well water. Before bed, Rowan walked around the cabin to check the windows, making sure every latch was set and every curtain pulled fully closed. He locked the only door with its stiff deadbolt, tugging once, then twice, habit from living in a noisier neighborhood with frequent car alarms nearby. Outside, the porch light reached only as far as the snow-covered steps. Beyond that, everything turned immediately into shapeless blue-tinted dark. Inside, the battery recorder sat on the mantel facing the couch and kitchen, close enough to pick up their voices clearly whenever they spoke. They changed into sweats, brushed their teeth, then argued briefly over whether to leave the hallway nightlight plugged in near the bathroom. Eliza liked the faint glow, saying it helped her orient if she woke suddenly, and Rowan said the cabin already had too many shadows. They left the light on, a dull amber plug casting a small horseshoe of brightness across the hallway floor and up one side of the wall. Sometime after midnight, long after the music speaker died, the only sound in the cabin was the wood stove ticking as it cooled. Temperature dropped outside, and branches shifted under the crusted snow, making occasional muffled pops that never quite reached the bedroom. Around 2 in the morning, according to the cabin's cheap digital clock, something knocked hard, once, from inside the main room. Eliza woke first, confused, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide whether the noise had been a dream or part of the stove. Then it came again, not like a branch, not like settling wood, but like knuckles on hollow drywall. 3 short, deliberate hits. "Rowan, wake up," she whispered, her throat dry, her eyes trying to adjust to the faint amber spill from the hallway nightlight. Rowan listened without moving for a few seconds, the way he did when a strange noise came from the apartment hallway back home. The cabin stayed silent, except for the faint buzz of the old refrigerator and the occasional quiet creak near the baseboards. "Probably the stove," he mumbled. But before he could finish, the knocking came a third time, higher pitched now, sharper, closer. It sounded like it came from the middle of the main room, not near any wall, as if the air itself had been struck with a fist. That detail mattered later, when people tried to match the sound to pipes or wind or the contracting roof and could not. Rowan swung his legs out of bed, feeling the cold wooden floor stabbing through his socks, and grabbed the metal flashlight. The nightlight shaped the hallway into a short tunnel. Their bedroom at one end, the main room at the other, darker and wider. He could see the faint outline of the mantel from his doorway and the tiny red power light of the recorder still blinking steadily. "Stay here," he said, though Eliza was already sitting up, watching his silhouette move slowly away from the safety of the bedroom. The knocking did not repeat as he walked, and that silence felt worse somehow, like something listening just out of view. He swept the flashlight beam across the main room, over the couch, the empty armchair, the coffee table stacked with board games. Nothing looked disturbed, nothing looked shifted. The remotes sat exactly where he had left them. The wood stove door was still latched. He checked the front door, finding the deadbolt fully extended, the chain still hooked, and the cold bleeding faintly around the frame. Every window he passed was still locked, their latches pointed down, the panes fogged slightly instead of showing anything clearly outside. He even looked under the couch, feeling slightly ridiculous, shining the light into dust and an old dropped bottle cap. The sound did not return, and when he came back to the bedroom, Eliza forced a small laugh that did not sound like her usual voice. "Probably the wood shrinking," she said, trying a normal tone, though her hands stayed clenched in the blanket near her knees. Rowan nodded, though he paused first by the recorder on the mantel, noticing that its tiny red light still blinked at the same steady pace. He considered stopping it, then decided leaving it running might be smart, just in case there really was something to review tomorrow. Back in bed, they lay awake longer than either admitted, listening to every insignificant creak as if it might repeat that exact strange rhythm. They fell asleep sometime near dawn, waking late to pale light reflecting off thick snow on the lake, quiet and harmless again. Eliza made coffee while Rowan fed the fire, trying to turn the night into a story they could retell as a creepy vacation moment. After breakfast, he crossed to the recorder, flipped it off, and set it carefully on the table, both of them suddenly serious. They connected it to Rowan's laptop with a cable the owner had left, then watched the audio file appear, a neat digital rectangle. The timeline showed 4 hours of mostly flat ambient sound, with 2 clear spikes somewhere after the halfway point of the recording. Rowan clicked play, and they listened to themselves choose a movie, complain about the stove, and tease each other about the nightlight. Their voices sounded oddly distant and casual, as if they belonged to other people, visiting someone else's rental cabin for the weekend. Eventually, the background quieted, and they heard the rustling of blankets, the last small cough, then a long stretch of near silence. The first spike arrived with a muffled thump, which made both of them shiver slightly, even though it sounded softer than remembered. On the second playthrough, Eliza leaned closer, frowning, because she noticed a faint intake of breath just before the thump landed. Not theirs, not any sound they recognized from the bedroom, more like someone standing in the main room taking a slow, deliberate breath. Could be the mic, Rowan said, though even he sounded unconvinced, his eyes fixed on the jagged shape of the spike on the screen. Then they reached the second spike, the one the timeline showed as 3 vertical peaks almost touching the top of the waveform. Rowan turned the volume down slightly, then hit play, and the room seemed to tighten around them as the speakers carried the sound. The 3 knocks were clear, hollow, metallic at the edges, neither from wood nor glass, more like something striking empty air efficiently. Between the first and second knock, the recorder captured a whisper, lower than any normal speaking voice, but unmistakably formed words. "No one inside," it said quietly, as if reported from a distance. Yet there was no radio in the cabin, no television, no other device. Rowan stopped the recording immediately, the cursor freezing on the second peak, while both of them just stared at the laptop screen. They rewound, then played again, this time leaned so close their shoulders touched, like children trying to hear a secret through a wall. The words stayed the same, the timing stayed the same, and the whisper always emerged between the knocks, steady, almost calm. Eliza felt her stomach flip as she realized the whisper did not match either of their voices, not even distorted, not even close. It had a dry rasp, like vocal cords that rarely spoke, and a strange accent, vowels stretched slightly, consonants clipped at the edges. "Maybe someone outside," Rowan said, though he remembered how every window had been locked, how the snow around the steps was untouched. "If it was outside," she answered, "it would sound distant, muffled, not right next to the mic like that voice sounds." They checked the recorder itself, looking for any Bluetooth indicator, any sign it could connect to a hidden speaker or nearby device. There was nothing fancy about it, just a budget model, no wireless features, no memory card slot, only a simple internal drive. Rowan picked it up and shook it lightly beside his ear, hearing only the faint rattle of its cheap casing and loose battery door. He set it down again, more carefully than before, as if dropping it might shake some invisible explanation loose from inside its plastic. By midday, the strange feeling in the cabin grew heavier, like the atmosphere after an unresolved argument, except they were not fighting. Every time one of them walked past the recorder, they felt an urge to pick it up again, to replay the same 15 seconds repeatedly. Instead, they decided to leave the cabin for a while, to clear their heads and maybe find cell signal near the highway. They bundled up, locked the door carefully as they left, and trudged through the crunching snow toward the narrow trail to the road. At the small highway turnout, Rowan finally caught a bar of service and called the number on their rental agreement, reaching the owner. Her name was Tamsin, retired, calm, the kind of person who sounded like she had dealt with drama from teenagers for decades before. Rowan explained the knocking, the voice, the locked door, the snow, speaking quickly, almost apologizing for how it all sounded out loud. On the other end, there was a long, quiet pause, broken only by a slight hiss from the weak signal. Then the owner finally spoke. "I need you both to come into town," she said, her tone changing, more measured now, giving instructions the way teachers give instructions. "There is a small sheriff substation near the grocery store. I will meet you there, bring the recorder and the laptop with you." She did not say it was a prank, she did not laugh, and that seriousness unnerved Rowan more than any skepticism would have. They drove the old compact car provided with the cabin package, following her directions until a low brick building appeared near the store. Inside, a deputy with graying hair and a slow manner introduced himself as Deputy Carden, then asked them to describe everything again. He listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the owner, who had arrived and sat quietly near the doorway, arms folded. When they finished, he motioned for the laptop, then put on a pair of headphones from his desk, bracing his elbows on a stack of reports. He listened to the recording twice, his face tightening slightly at the second set of knocks, his eyes shifting briefly toward the owner. Finally, he slid the headphones off and asked a few practical questions about their evening. Drinks consumed, pills taken, any arguments. They answered honestly, and none of it seemed to explain why a stranger's whisper had appeared between two impossible indoor knocks. Then the owner cleared her throat, looking not at them but at the deputy, as if signaling it was time to say something rehearsed. "Tell them about the other one," she said quietly, and the way she said other made the hair on Eliza's arms rise under her coat. Carden exhaled slowly, then opened a folder on his desk, pulling out a printed call log summary from several winters earlier. He explained that in late winter of either 2015 or 2016, records disagreed slightly. Another couple had rented the cabin. Their names were redacted on the copy he showed, a standard privacy practice, though the highlighted lines told enough of the story. They had called 911 from the cabin landline around 2 in the morning, reporting a noise inside the locked main room. According to the archived dispatch notes, the caller claimed that knocks were coming from somewhere near the middle of the room. The deputy on duty back then had been Carden himself, and he had driven out, finding no footprints, no sign of forced entry anywhere. The couple were shaken but unhurt, and he had written the incident off as nerves and unfamiliar forest sounds, though he had disliked that decision. There had been no recorder requirement at the time, no audio stored, just his report and the small note that the case remained unsolved. After that incident, the owner had installed the recorder rule, partly for safety, partly because she wanted evidence next time something happened. She admitted there had been one other strange file, 2 winters after the first couple, but that recording had reportedly been corrupted. The waveform had appeared normal until the first knock, then turned into a block of static that repeated the same 10 seconds indefinitely. Only one phrase remained intelligible in that damaged audio, heavily distorted yet audible if somebody strained through the static carefully. According to a technician who had examined it, the tangled noise contained what sounded like a male voice saying "no one" inside repeatedly. Hearing their own recording, with the same words spoken clearly between knocks in their intact file, gave Rowan and Eliza a hollow feeling. They asked whether the previous couples had been harmed later, maybe in accidents, anything that might connect the cabin to something worse. Carden flipped through his notes, then shook his head, saying there were no reports linking them to crimes or deaths after their stays. Reluctantly, he admitted something else, something that bothered him enough to keep a copy of that first report in his personal drawer. In that earlier call, the male renter had told dispatch the knocks seemed to come from the center of the room, not the walls. He had described it as if a person were knocking in midair, standing where no one stood, where the air itself felt thick. Those words matched almost exactly what Rowan had just said at the station, which strengthened the feeling that something patterned was happening. They let the deputy copy their audio file, then returned to the cabin only long enough to pack, leaving the keys under the agreed rock. Neither of them slept properly for several days afterward, even in their apartment far from the lake and its strange hollow knocks. Weeks later, out of uneasy curiosity, Rowan emailed the deputy, asking whether any analysis had found a rational source for the whisper. Carden replied with a short note, saying the sound lab had ruled out radio bleed, interference, or any ordinary known equipment malfunction. The whisper, according to the report, did not match standard human speech patterns in the way air vibrated, although it contained clear language. The lab had written that the signal behaved as if the source were extremely close to the microphone, with no detectable approach or retreat. In other words, it appeared suddenly almost inside the device, spoke the words "no one inside," then vanished as though it had never breathed. Rowan read that line several times, remembering how the locked cabin had felt that night, wrapped in snow and silence and something unaccounted. To this day, the owner still rents the place, but the recorder rule remains, and guests sign the same checklist without much concern. Some leave after quiet weeks spent fishing and reading, never hearing more than the occasional snap of a distant frozen branch. Others, according to dispatch logs and sparse online posts, have phoned in about late-night noises without leaving any usable recordings behind. Only that one file from Rowan and Eliza's stay sits on a deputy's desktop, replayed sometimes on winter nights when the station is quiet. Whenever he hears the three sharp knocks, followed by that steady, low whisper stating no one inside, Carden feels the same chill again. It is not the sound itself that bothers him most, but the calm, almost confirming tone, like a note added in the margin of reality. As far as official records go, nothing has ever been found living or hiding between the walls of that small lakeside rental cabin. Yet the audio remains, a small digital artifact suggesting something else was present inside that locked room, counting who belonged there. Even now, when snow stacks against old doors and night falls very fast in those woods, a few people still think about that voice. They imagine a presence that does not try to enter or leave, only listens and reports, marking who is there and who is not. Most visitors never hear anything, never play back anything strange, and the cabin stays just another winter getaway on a frozen, quiet lake. Still, the audio exists, and for some, that is enough to believe the unexplainable sound inside their locked cabin was exactly what it claimed. The terrifying Yosemite Trail case rangers still talk about. Rangers in the region still mention this case because the evidence found on that trail created questions they never resolved. The most unsettling details centered on a series of sounds captured by a missing hiker that did not match any wildlife known in the park. Taryn Wild, a 33-year-old seasonal maintenance worker, visited Yosemite on his day off to hike a lesser-used route above an old granite ridge. His simple plan was to reach an upper overlook before sunset, take several photos for his project log, then head down before the temperature dropped. He checked in with a friend by text around midday and said the trail felt strangely empty despite normal visitor traffic in nearby areas. He reached the ridge around early afternoon and recorded several notes about soil shifts near a cluster of loose stones. His final text mentioned hearing steady pacing sounds behind him, even though he had not seen anyone on the trail for nearly an hour. He told his friend not to worry and said he would be back before evening. That message marked his last confirmed communication. A ranger patrol located Taryn's car in the trailhead lot later that night. Inside, they found his pack with only one item missing, a slim audio device he used while documenting trail conditions for his project. Ranger Helvey Strauss led the search at first light and found fresh boot prints near the ridge that matched the soles of Taryn's hiking shoes. The prints looked steady until they reached a shaded corner where the soil turned softer. There, the tracks split in an unusual way. One set continued toward the overlook, while another set curved sharply toward a narrow run of boulders. Helvey believed Taryn might have stepped off the trail while exploring, but noticed that the second set of prints forced deeper impressions, as if he moved faster with each step. A thin line in the dirt followed those prints and suggested something had been dragged behind him. The team followed the marks until they reached a natural pocket between two high stones. Inside, they discovered Taryn's audio device lodged against a root. It still functioned and held one final recording. The first minute captured wind passing through trees and small rocks shifting under his boots. Then Taryn whispered that he felt followed by someone who kept repeating his pace a moment after he stopped. In the next part of the audio, a low grinding sound echoed in uneven pulses. The tone rose and fell as if something scraped along stone with deliberate force. Taryn asked if anyone was there and paused. Another voice answered him with a strained whisper that sounded almost identical to his own. Helvey replayed that section several times and said the response arrived with a slight delay, which made the mimicry more disturbing. The prince left the stone pocket and continued toward a narrow chute formed by erosion. Helvey and her partner Nora Kale climbed through and found more concerning signs. Long grooves marked the walls as if something had braced itself while moving upward. The grooves aligned in patterns that suggested fingers rather than claws, yet their spacing indicated a taller figure than anyone on the search team. Above the chute, they found Taryn's hat pressed into damp soil beside a shallow depression. The depression held two overlapping prints. One matched Taryn's shoe, the other stretched nearly twice the length of a normal boot and narrowed sharply at one end. Norik measured the print with a small ruler and muttered that no known animal in the park left impressions shaped like that. They continued toward the overlook and reached a rocky shelf with a clear drop. Several scuff marks indicated Taryn may have slipped or struggled there. A single boot print led to the edge, but none led away. Helvey considered the possibility of a fall, but found no debris or clothing caught on lower branches. The drop also lacked fresh disturbance, despite the clear signs of a struggle above. Rangers widened the grid and discovered a second audio device deeper along the ridge. This one belonged to the Park Service and had been installed as part of a small research project. It recorded ambient sounds every hour. The file from the time of Taryn's disappearance contained a short sequence of noises that technicians later flagged as highly unusual. The recording captured a heavy step followed by a second heavier impact a moment later. Then a slow hum rose from the left channel and drifted across the microphone with irregular movement. After several seconds, the hum changed pitch and formed a wavering tone that did not match common environmental sources. The final part of the audio held a faint whisper that repeated 5 words spoken minutes earlier by Taryn on his device. Helvey brought the recordings to a small ranger station for review. Several officers listened and stepped back from the speakers at almost the same moment. One officer said the whisper sounded like a distorted copy of Taryn's voice produced by something that did not understand human timing. Another officer said the hum felt directional even through the recording, almost like a body of air shifted with intentional weight. Search teams continued for several days and found additional signs near an unmarked fissure west of the overlook. The fissure opened into a short passage filled with broken branches and scattered soil. Along one wall, faint finger lines traced downward in uneven arcs. The height of the marks indicated a figure far taller than Taryn. At the bottom of the passage, they located a torn piece of Taryn's shirt wedged between 2 stones. Specialists examined the site and concluded that no official map recorded any cave or fissure in that section of the ridge. They also stated that the elongated prints found earlier did not fit any catalog species in the region. Audio analysts reviewed both recordings and noted that the mimicry matched Taryn's cadence but not his breath patterns, which suggested a source repeating structure rather than meaning. Rangers eventually suspended the search due to unsafe terrain conditions. The official report listed Taryn as missing with no determination of cause. Helvey filed a final note stating that something on the ridge moved only after Taryn paused, which matched his comments about delayed pacing. She believed the creature or force followed a pattern of waiting for silence before responding. Visitors now pass that trail with more caution. Some hikers claim to hear footstep echoes that do not match their own rhythm. Others mention hearing low humming tones near the ridge when the wind drops. Rangers dismiss most reports, yet avoid the area during low light. The case remains open with evidence stored in a restricted cabinet. The 2 recordings sit at the top of the file. Technicians mark them with a warning that the audio contains mimicry exhibiting unknown origin. Rangers still talk about this case because the trail shows new stone shifts each season, even though no mapped feature exists beneath it. Many believe that whatever followed Taryn waited in those rocks long before anyone walked that ridge and might still wait for the next person who stops to listen. A missing hiker reported someone behind him moments before silence. The call came in just after 4 in the afternoon, and the dispatcher immediately knew something was wrong. The man on the line spoke in a low, shaky voice and said he was hiking an old fire access trail outside a remote canyon. He kept repeating that someone was behind him. When the dispatcher asked if he could see the person, the man whispered no, but he could hear footsteps right after his own. Then the call cut out. The hiker was Rowan Naris, a 31-year-old outdoor photographer who frequently visited that canyon for long solo trips. He was experienced, always prepared, and never the type to panic. That made his final recorded words much more alarming. deputies found Rowan's car parked neatly at the small gravel lot near the gate. Inside sat his gear case, a water bottle, and a folded map with one route outlined. That route led to a narrow shoulder of trail called Switch Bend, known for unusual acoustics created by sheer rock on both sides. Locals said the place echoed strangely at night, but nothing dangerous was ever reported there. A search team followed Rowan's boot prints along the trail and noticed something odd within the first half mile. His steps were steady until they reached the canyon's echo pocket. From there, his prints grew closer together, as if he started walking cautiously. Another set of impressions appeared beside his footprints, long, narrow marks shaped nothing like boots or hooves. They trailed him for several yards, then vanished abruptly at a cluster of stones. A deputy named Ryland Torr replayed the last seconds of Rowan's call using his body camera microphone. When the volume was raised, everyone heard it. Right after Rowan said someone was behind him, a faint whisper overlapped his voice. It didn't sound like wind or static. It sounded like Rowan repeating his own words, only thinner, strained, and a moment out of sync. The team found Rowan's small audio recorder a mile farther up the trail. It was lying on a smooth rock, still running. The first part of the file contained Rowan walking, breathing lightly, and occasionally talking into the device about lighting conditions for his photos. Then his tone changed. He whispered that he felt watched, even though he had checked behind him several times. He said the footsteps kept matching him, but always arrived a little late. The next section of audio recorded something moving through brush with slow scraping friction. Rowan asked if anyone was there. A second voice answered him with a faint version of his question, as if repeating his exact sentence in a disjointed echo. Rowan's breathing sped up. He whispered that the voice sounded close, much closer than the footsteps. The final 10 seconds were the most disturbing. Rowan said, "It's right behind me." Then came a sharp inhale from something just off the recorder's mic, followed by Rowan breaking into a run. After that, the audio dissolved into a heavy rush of air, a single impact, and total silence. Search teams found signs of a struggle near a narrow rock slot farther up the trail. Soil had been swept clean in uneven patches, and scuff marks suggested Rowan slipped or was pulled off balance. No prints led away from the clearing. No broken branches, no drop marks, nothing indicating a direction of travel. The only clues sat at the base of the rock slot. 3 elongated impressions in the dirt, spaced in a strange rhythmic pattern. Rangers said they were too long for a human foot, but too narrow for an animal. One print overlapped Rowan's last boot mark. Specialists reviewed the audio and confirmed the second voice was not an electronic echo. It lacked the acoustic signature of canyon bounceback. It also repeated Rowan's tone, but not his breath, meaning it copied structure without copying life behind it. The canyon was closed for 2 weeks while a wider team searched the slopes and drainage channels. They found no remains, no additional gear, no sign that Rowan ever left the immediate trail corridor. It was as if he vanished the moment the recording ended. The official report listed Rowan as missing with unexplained circumstances. Unofficially, rangers still warn each other about Switchbend. Some say the canyon echoes are not echoes at all. They say the place answers you, not instantly, not naturally. A second late, like someone standing where you just stood, whispering your own words back to you. Rowan's final recording remains locked in evidence. The dispatcher who took his last call refuses to listen to it again. She told investigators the same thing she writes in her incident notes. When a voice repeats someone's words after they stop speaking, it usually means the caller is not alone. She said Rowan went silent because whatever stood behind him finally closed the gap. The Glacier National Park Trail nobody will hike anymore. Rangers still warn newcomers about this case because the evidence recovered along that trail convinced many of them that something in those woods reacted to people in ways no animal should. The trail has been closed for years, yet the story continues to circulate quietly among staff who were there when it happened. Merrick Kellen, a 34-year-old backcountry maintenance tech, entered Glacier National Park early one morning to inspect a rarely used service trail near the eastern treeline. His job that day was simple: check drainage channels, replace a pair of damaged signs, and test a small sensor the research team had installed along the ridge. He radioed his supervisor just after sunrise and said the weather looked perfect for a quick loop. His last recorded message came 90 minutes later. He said the trail felt wrong in a way he could not explain. He mentioned hearing something walk behind him with a staggered rhythm that always arrived a few seconds after he stopped moving. The supervisor asked if he needed assistance. Merrick responded that it was probably echo, then promised to check the ridge and call again when he headed back. He never made that call. Rangers found his truck parked neatly at the service gate that afternoon. Inside lay his pack with every piece of gear present except his small field recorder. A set of steady boot prints led from the truck toward the old path, then turned strangely narrow after the first quarter mile, as if Marek had started walking with shorter, more cautious steps. A ranger named Karen Haldy followed the trail until she reached a steep bend where the soil grew softer. There she found two overlapping sets of tracks. One set matched Marek's boots. The second set appeared longer, deeper, and shaped in a way that did not match human or animal patterns cataloged for the area. The elongated prints trailed beside his path for several yards, then cut into the trees. Karen called for backup. A second ranger, Dakin Rowe, searched the brush and discovered the first piece of evidence wedged under a fallen branch. It was Marek's field recorder, still running and warm from recent use. Dakin paused before pressing play. The first minute captured Marek breathing hard as he whispered that something kept following him without matching the sound of normal footsteps. In the next section, a low, reverberating hum drifted across the microphone. The tone pulsed with irregular timing and wavered like it struggled to hold a single pitch. When Marek spoke again, the recorder caught a second voice repeating his words in a strained whisper that arrived a moment too late. Rangers listening to the playback said the mimicry felt wrong, almost like a delayed shadow of speech rather than an echo. The trail beyond that point narrowed between tall stones shaped by old glacial movement. Karen noticed deep grooves carved into the rock walls that looked deliberate. The grooves stood at shoulder height for someone far taller than Marek. A faint metallic scent lingered along the stone, carried by a cold draft that should not have existed on a windless afternoon. They followed the tracks to a small clearing where the research sensor stood half-buried in torn soil. The device, which normally recorded temperature and short ambient clips, had captured one alarming file. At the moment Marek disappeared, the sensor picked up a rapid vibration that grew until the microphone overloaded. The vibration held a rising tone before breaking into a harsh clicking pattern that technicians later said did not match wind, wildlife, or human activity. Beyond the sensor, the elongated prints appeared again. This time, they circled a shallow depression pressed into the ground. In the center lay Marek's radio, its casing cracked but still powered. The last message stored on the device replayed automatically when Dakin activated it. Marek whispered that something stood between the trees and copied his breathing with perfect precision, but delayed by a single second. The most disturbing detail came from the final few seconds. Marek said the shape behind him moved without sound until it inhaled. He said the inhale felt too close, almost touching the back of his neck. Then, the recording ended with a sharp shift in air pressure that made the radio speaker distort. Rangers found one final piece of evidence near a narrow break in the rocks. A strip of Marek's shirt had been caught on a jagged edge. The ground leading toward the break showed scuff marks shaped like knees dragging or someone pulled forward while resisting. No prints continued beyond the opening, and no disturbed soil appeared on the other side. Specialists examined the site for days. They confirmed that the elongated tracks did not match bear, moose, wolf, or any known species. They also noted that the mimicry on the recorder lacked breath patterns, which suggested the voice repeated Marek's words in structure only, not in human rhythm. The vibration captured by the sensor carried layered frequencies that normally appear only in artificial testing environments, not in open wilderness. Park officials closed the trail permanently. They cited unstable terrain and rockfall risk in their public announcement, but rangers who worked that case said the closure came from something deeper. Karen filed a final statement saying the prints always appeared beside Marek's until the last clearing, where they circled him instead. She believed the creature or unknown force followed a pattern of staying just out of view until he stopped walking. Visitors still talk about strange sounds in that region of the park. Some hikers claim they hear footstep echoes that lag behind their own. Others say they feel a breath of cold air on their neck, even without wind. Rangers warn people not to wander near the old service path and never stop for long if they do. The Glacier National Park Trail remains abandoned, with markers removed and the entrance grown over. Those who worked the search insist that something on that ridge moved when people went silent, and that whatever followed, Merrick waited for the moment he hesitated before stepping out of the trees. The terrifying motel case that investigators tried to bury. A small-town motel incident reportedly led to sealed archives that puzzled locals for years, and the title came from those buried findings. The few investigators who spoke about it later hinted at details that made others uneasy, and they claimed the truth was nearly erased. The incident centered on a quiet traveler named Ryland Dorsey who checked into a roadside motel during a long winter drive through a rural county. Ryland was 34 and worked as a field technician for an energy company that sent him across different states. That day, he planned to rest before finishing a site check scheduled for the next morning, and he picked a cheap motel near an old highway exit. He parked his truck near a row of dim lights and walked into the lobby where the manager looked half asleep behind the counter. The manager handed him a key card and muttered something about a broken ice machine. Ryland did not mind the fading carpet or the outdated wallpaper since he only needed a few hours of sleep before driving again. He dropped his bag near the bed and turned on the small lamp beside the nightstand. He noticed a strange chemical smell that reminded him of old storage rooms, and he made a note to ask for a different room if it bothered him. He stepped out briefly to grab food from his truck before locking the door for the night. When he returned, he heard a faint knocking sound inside the walls that seemed too steady to be pipes settling. He leaned close to the drywall and listened as the noise stopped before starting again with a slow, rhythmic pattern. He checked the vents in the bathroom but found nothing unusual, and he assumed rodents made their way into the walls during colder months. He tried to ignore it and focused on his food while checking a few work messages. The incident began when he turned off the lamp and prepared to sleep, because the knock changed direction and seemed to come from behind the headboard. Ryland sat up and said, "Who is there?" But no answer came from the dark corner near the curtains. He turned the lamp back on and slid the bed away from the wall, and he saw small scratches on the baseboard that looked recent. He took a picture on his phone to document them in case the motel blamed him for damage. He walked to the lobby to request another room. Yet he found the front desk empty and the office door locked from inside. A television played quietly behind the counter, despite no one being present, and a clipboard listed check-ins for the week with several names crossed out. Ryland called out but heard nothing except the buzz from an old fluorescent light near the ceiling. He returned to his room with the idea of packing up and finding a different motel farther down the highway. While he gathered his things, he noticed his phone displayed a new voicemail with no caller ID, and the recording played static for several seconds before a faint voice said his surname. He replayed it twice before deciding it sounded too distorted to judge clearly, and he wondered if his work dispatch system had glitched again. He still felt uneasy, so he placed his gear near the door as he continued examining the room for anything suspicious. The complication deepened when he spotted an envelope under the bed that looked recently placed, and the front read Room 7 in shaky handwriting. Inside was a small photograph of the same room taken from a low angle near the bathroom doorway, and the printed timestamp showed early morning hours of an unspecified date. Ryland flipped the photo to check for notes yet found only faint smudges near the edges that looked like fingerprints. He felt a wave of pressure in his chest as he realized someone had taken the picture without permission. Ryland began his own investigation by checking the dresser drawers, where he found an old guest directory with pages missing near the back. A faint indentation on one torn page spelled the name Callum Foy, and a date beneath it hinted at something from the early 2000s. He searched the room for anything else connected to that name and found a scratched keyring behind the mini-fridge. Someone had carved initials that matched the name, and he took another photo to document the find. He decided to explore the hallway and saw that several rooms showed signs of forced repairs, and the motel layout did not match the numbered sequence on the map near the stairwell. A couple who stayed in the room across the hall told him they heard repairs at night that never seemed finished. They recalled a deputy who once checked the property for missing person reports, and they mentioned a strange event from years earlier that staff refused to discuss. Rylan wrote their comments in his phone notes to keep a timeline. When he stepped outside for better reception, he noticed two older security cameras pointed toward the rooms near his, and both had frayed cables that seemed cut rather than weather-worn. He inspected the nearest camera housing and saw residue that suggested someone removed a memory card recently. He began connecting details, including the scratched baseboard, strange knocks, old photograph, missing directory pages, and severed camera lines. Everything pointed toward hidden surveillance or a long-ignored incident. Rylan attempted to contact county dispatch and reached a board operator who recognized the motel name and paused before answering further questions. The operator claimed maintenance calls often came from that property but ended abruptly when crews arrived. When Rylan asked about an incident involving someone named Callum, the operator ended the call with a quick statement that the line needed to be cleared for emergencies. Rylan found the reaction suspicious and decided to pack up completely before something else happened. His decision came too late because a heavy thud struck the wall beside the bathroom as he zipped his bag, and dust drifted from a new crack near the ceiling. He stepped back and watched the drywall push inward like something had leaned against it from the other side. A muffled voice sounded like someone trying to speak through a barrier, and it said a single word that resembled help. Rylan felt fear tighten his entire body as he realized the voice sounded recent and not like an echo from old damage. He recorded the sound with his phone and hurried into the hallway where he saw the manager emerging from the dark office with a flashlight. The manager froze when he saw the phone raised toward him and suggested Rylan leave without filing a complaint. Rylan demanded to know if someone was trapped behind the walls, and the manager claimed renovations years earlier sealed unused maintenance corridors. The explanation felt weak because the dust in the crack looked fresh, and the voice did not resemble any airflow noise. Rylan stepped outside and flagged a patrol car that happened to slow near the entrance, and the deputy reluctantly followed him to the room. The deputy pressed his ear to the cracked section of wall and stepped back with a concerned look. He radioed for a second unit, but changed his tone after speaking quietly with the motel manager. Instead of checking further, he ordered Rylan to collect his belongings and leave the property. The deputy wrote nothing in his notebook and refused to let Rylan remain near the room. According to Rylan, the deputy escorted him to his truck and waited until he drove away, and no paperwork documented the encounter. Rylan parked at a gas station several miles away and listened to the recording he captured, and the voice again whispered help before static overtook the sound. He sent the file to a friend who worked in a different county office and asked him to run a quiet check on past reports involving the motel. That friend later told him that several pages in the old archives were sealed after a missing person investigation involving someone named Callum Foy. The payoff came when the friend admitted the sealed pages included descriptions of a maintenance crawlspace project from the early 2000s, and a contractor reported that a worker vanished during debris clearing. The motel ownership allegedly pushed to keep operations open, and the investigation stalled after a few weeks. Those pages matched the same time frame as the torn directory entry in Rylan's room, and the friend believed the incident was buried to avoid legal trouble. Rylan later passed the findings to a local reporter who tried to question county officials, yet none agreed to speak on record. The motel eventually renovated the entire wing where Rylan stayed, and workers claimed they heard strange muffled sounds during demolition. The county released a short statement saying no current threat existed, and they made no comment about the sealed archives or missing worker. The case never reached a full reopening, but Rylan always said the voice behind the wall did not sound like an echo from old plaster. He moved away from fieldwork soon after and kept the photograph from the envelope as a reminder. The truth behind that motel room stayed hidden inside scattered notes and old recordings, and officials eventually stopped responding to questions about it. Rylan believed someone tried to bury the findings because reopening them would reveal more than anyone wanted to admit. Real footage from the motel hallway minutes before he disappeared. The motel kept the hallway camera mostly for drunks and noise complaints, not for the kind of mystery that followed later. When investigators finally pulled the footage, they said the last few minutes looked ordinary at first, then increasingly wrong. The man in that video was 29-year-old Rowan Hestrel, a refrigeration tech driving between small towns for routine service calls. He lived out of a faded compact car most weeks and took whatever overnight work his company could hand him. Co-workers described him as quiet, a little anxious around crowds, but dependable when things broke down unexpectedly. On the night in question, he checked into a roadside motel off a state highway and asked for a top-floor room away from the vending machines. The clerk on duty was a 38-year-old woman named Kira Malden, who worked nights to cover her brother's medical bills. She later told officers that Rowan seemed tired but polite, the kind of guest who kept his key card in a shirt pocket and apologized for taking too long signing the form. He asked if the motel had decent locks and whether anyone else was on his floor. Kira told him only 2 rooms were occupied that night, both far from his. Rowan carried a duffel bag, a hard tool case, and a backpack with his work tablet and personal notebook. The hallway camera caught him exiting the elevator just before 10 at night. He walked toward his room at a normal pace, shoulders a little hunched from the weight. Investigators later noted that he glanced toward the far end of the hallway, where an emergency exit door stood closed and unremarkable. According to Kira, the rest of the shift stayed quiet. A couple argued softly in the parking lot, then drove away. A freight truck idled near the gas station across the road. Around midnight, Kira stepped outside to clear her head and watched fog slide over the highway lights. She remembered thinking the building felt unusually hollow, like everyone inside held their breath at the same moment. Rowan's phone record showed a short call to his younger cousin around 11:30. He told her the motel seemed fine, although the hallway felt colder than the parking lot. He mentioned hearing a faint knocking sound behind the walls near his room. His cousin suggested it was probably the ice machine or plumbing, and he laughed and agreed. That was the last confirmed conversation from his number. A little after 1 in the morning, Kira logged an internal note about strange interference on the front desk computer. The cursor jumped slightly, and the security monitor for the 3rd floor flickered with static for a few seconds. She tapped the side of the monitor, and the image stabilized again. At that moment, Rowan's door was closed, and no one else moved in the hallway. The critical footage began at 1:13. Rowan opened his door slowly and stepped out wearing the same jeans and work shirt, but with bare feet. He held his phone in one hand and the keycard in the other. The camera caught him pausing, head tilted as if listening to something out of frame. He moved down the hallway toward the emergency exit, not toward the elevator, which sat closer. Investigators zoomed in on his face repeatedly. His expression looked focused, not panicked. His eyes shifted upward toward the ceiling corners as he walked. At one point, he turned slightly, as if checking that his room door remained shut, then faced forward again. The footage showed no one else present. No other doors opened. No shadows crossed behind him. At 1:14, he stopped halfway between his room and the exit door. His shoulders tightened and his head turned to the right wall. The camera showed plain off-white paint and a framed evacuation map, nothing unusual. Witness statements from previous guests mentioned occasional banging from the pipes beside that wall, especially during winter. The motel boiler records from that night showed no abnormal activity, according to maintenance logs reviewed later. Rowan then did something that confused investigators. Instead of continuing toward the exit, he set his phone on the carpeted floor, screen facing up. He also dropped his keycard beside it. He stared at both items for several seconds, standing perfectly still. A technician later measured that he remained motionless for nearly 14 seconds, longer than most guests ever paused in that hall. At 1:15, a faint shadow appeared at the far end of the frame near the emergency exit door. It was narrow and vertical, darker than the surrounding wall, but not shaped like a human form. The motel used overhead fluorescent fixtures spaced evenly along the ceiling, and none of the bulbs showed issues before or after that night. When investigators tested the lights, they could not recreate the same shadow by having someone walk near the door. Rowan seemed to notice something at that exact moment. He lifted his head and took a single step toward the shadowed end. His posture looked reluctant, as if his body leaned back while his legs moved forward. Then the feed glitched with a brief smear of pixels, not long enough to count as a full cut. When the picture cleared, he had moved several feet closer to the emergency exit. Audio from the camera did not exist, so no one heard what he might have responded to. Still, the timing matched a separate piece of evidence. A guest on the second floor, a nurse named Drana Pole, told deputies she woke around that time to a low humming sound above her room. She described it as a distant air conditioner running inside a metal box, steady and monotone, unlike the usual short bursts of the hallway unit. The hallway footage continued, with Rowan now almost at the emergency exit. The strange vertical shadow remained near the corner, not touching the floor or ceiling. It floated at about shoulder height, slightly wavering but not leaving the general spot. He lifted his right hand toward it, though there was clearly nothing physical to touch. As his fingers reached the edge of that darker patch, the video showed a brief distortion across his arm, like heat shimmer recorded at low resolution. At 1:16, he turned his head sharply back toward his room, then toward the elevator, seeming ready to retreat. For a moment, his body language matched someone about to abandon a bad idea and head back to safety. Then his shoulders slumped slightly, and he stepped the remaining distance to the emergency exit door. The shadow vanished from the frame at that exact second. He gripped the push bar on the door but did not push through. Instead, he leaned his forehead against the metal for several beats. A later inspection found no outside security camera covering that specific exit. A loading dock light illuminated the parking lot beyond, but any image of what waited outside remained unknown. The weather report listed temperatures just above freezing, with light fog hanging over the highway. The last clear image of Rowan showed him pulling the emergency exit open about 6 inches. No alarms activated, because the motel had long since disconnected that door from the central panel. A narrow strip of outside air appeared in the frame, carrying a pale vapor that rolled along the hallway carpet. It did not spread like normal fog. It curled inward, then dissolved before reaching the nearest light. At 1:17, the camera captured a flicker. For 2 frames, the entire hallway darkened, then returned to normal. When the view stabilized, the emergency exit stood fully closed, and Rowan was gone. His phone and keycard still lay untouched on the carpet. No one walked back toward his room. No other door opened or closed. The next recorded movement showed a housekeeper pushing a cart at 9:40 the following morning. Kira did not know anything was wrong until Rowan's company called late that afternoon, asking whether he had checked out. She verified the room still showed as occupied in the computer, but received no answer at the door. She used a master key and stepped inside. His duffel bag sat open, with clothes folded inside. The tool case rested on the desk beside his notebook, open to a page of times and compressor readings from the previous job. One detail bothered her immediately. The bedspread was smoothed out perfectly, almost iron flat, with no imprint of someone sleeping there. A thin line of dust gathered along the windowsill, while the curtains remained partly open toward the highway. A single glass of water sat on the bedside table, still full, without condensation on the outside. Sheriff's deputies arrived within the hour. They found no obvious signs of struggle. The window was sealed from the inside, with no tampering around the latch. The bathroom light was off. Rowan's toothbrush remained dry in his toiletry kit. His car waited in the parking spot assigned at check-in, locked, with his overnight snack and a half-finished soda inside the console. When they pulled the hallway footage, the investigators expected to see him leave through the main door during the night. Instead, they watched the sequence near the emergency exit repeatedly, growing more unsettled each time. A state technician later examined the original file and the camera hardware. The device showed normal operation, no skipped timestamps, and no flagged power drops. He wrote that the minor pixel smearing likely came from the recording unit buffering during a small voltage fluctuation. Search teams combed the area behind the motel for 3 days. The emergency exit opened to a short concrete landing leading to a narrow strip of gravel. Beyond that sat a drainage ditch and a tree line that separated the property from an older industrial yard. Deputies walked the ditch, brought in dogs, and checked the yard's abandoned structures. No footprints matched Rowan's bare feet. No disturbed ground suggested a fall or forced movement. An archived call from the first night of the search added a detail many people still argue about. A driver who regularly used that stretch of highway phoned the non-emergency line just before dawn, claiming he saw someone standing on the outer edge of the motel roof. He described a figure facing away from the road, arms at the sides, barely visible in the fog-diffused light. By the time deputies reached the area, the roof was empty, and fresh frost showed no clear tracks. Investigators checked Rowan's background thoroughly. He had no history of mental health crises and no known involvement with drugs. His bank records showed modest savings and consistent spending. The only unusual activity in the weeks before his disappearance was a series of late-night searches on his tablet about recurring humming sounds and electrical interference. His cousin later said he complained about hearing an odd tone in several motels during the previous month, like something following him through different buildings. The motel retired the hallway camera a year later when a larger chain purchased the property and updated the system. Before that upgrade, copies of the critical footage circulated quietly among local deputies and a few technicians. Most agreed that Rowan walked out of frame under his own control, not dragged or chased. What bothered them was everything that seemed to lead him there, details that never added up to a normal explanation. One technician claimed off-record that when he slowed the video and stepped through the moments before Rowan vanished, he noticed a small interference pattern along the ceiling near the emergency exit. It looked like overlapping waves, hardly more than a shimmer, visible only when the brightness dropped slightly. Official reports never mentioned this detail, possibly because no one could reproduce it after the equipment changed. Kira eventually left the motel job. She said that every time she walked past the third floor on later shifts, the hallway felt colder near the emergency exit. She also said the area around the spot where Rowan left his phone always seemed strangely quiet, even on busy nights when kids ran through the building. She never admitted to avoiding that section, but coworkers noticed she rarely sent housekeepers up alone. The case remains open with no confirmed sightings. Rowan's family keeps a copy of one frame from the video, the last clear shot before he reached the emergency exit. In that still image, his face looks less afraid than resigned, like someone giving in to a noise only he could hear. Investigators still tell trainees about the motel footage when explaining how some disappearances leave behind more questions than answers. In the official filings, Rowan Hestrel is listed as missing with circumstances undetermined. The hallway footage survives as one of the few solid time-stamped records of his last minutes, yet it raises more doubts than comfort. There is no proof of a person waiting off camera, no clear evidence of deliberate harm, only a man walking toward a door that should have led to a simple concrete landing and a cold gravel strip behind a cheap roadside motel. The building has new paint now and a brighter sign, but guests still mention the third-floor hallway in online reviews. Some claim the lights there flicker more often, others say the air feels heavier near the far end. Those comments never mention Rowan directly, and most travelers scroll past without reading closely. For the people who watch the footage, though, that hallway will always feel occupied by a question that entered quietly one night and never walked back past the camera. Real footage from the forest that detectives refused to release. The case became known for one disturbing detail because a single piece of footage recovered from the woods was reportedly so unsettling that detectives refused to release it. That choice fueled rumors and made the disappearance at the center of the case far harder to explain. The day started like a normal field job for Nalan Keats, a 35-year-old wildlife technician who handled remote camera surveys for a small conservation agency. He drove to a dense stretch of protected land that locals avoided due to long-standing stories about strange echoes and uneasy silence. His simple plan was to replace batteries in several trail cameras, then record habitat notes before a rainstorm moved in. Nalan checked in by radio shortly before noon and mentioned that one camera appeared repositioned without any signs of animals causing the shift. He said it now faced a thicket that did not hold much traffic. His supervisor asked for photos so they could compare angles later. That was the last clear message anyone received from him. When Nalan failed to return that evening, deputies searched the forest road and found his truck parked neatly beside a service gate. Inside sat his gear bag with only one missing item, a small field recorder he often clipped to his vest. They also found a map with his planned route circled by hand. That route passed through an older grove where several trail cameras had recently recorded confusing motion triggers. A detective named Relda Var led the early search and noticed that Nalan's tracks appeared steady at first, but shifted into shorter, uneven steps as he moved deeper into the grove. She followed them until they ended abruptly near a cluster of fallen logs. From there, fresh drag marks cut into moist soil and curved toward a dark stand of pines. Relda said the marks looked too narrow for equipment and too controlled for an injured person. A deputy named Orrin Gale discovered the first piece of evidence near those pines. It was one of the agency's trail cameras smashed into two pieces, though its memory card remained intact. Orrin placed the card into his handheld viewer and motioned for Relda. The footage showed Nalan approaching the camera hours earlier, raising his hand in a casual greeting. Then something behind him caused the camera to glitch in short, erratic pulses, almost like a flicker of shadow crossing the lens. Relda replayed the clip several times and noticed that the background trees moved in slow, synchronized patterns that did not match the wind conditions reported that day. She also heard a faint tone under the ambient noise, as if something hummed in a deliberate rhythm. When the clip reached the final frames, Nalan turned sharply as if reacting to a voice. The recording ended right as the camera shook violently. The team pushed deeper into the pines and found more unsettling details. Broken twigs lay arranged in oddly precise angles, forming narrow lines across the forest floor. Some lines pointed toward a shallow ravine where several more tracks appeared. Those tracks alternated between Nalan's boot prints and long impressions that seemed too elongated to belong to any known animal in the region. Relda measured one and frowned when she realized it stretched nearly the length of her forearm. The ravine held the second camera. This one remained intact and still recorded. Detectives later said the footage taken from that device became the heart of the case. The clip reportedly showed Nalan whispering that something kept repeating his footsteps only seconds after he stopped walking. He said he felt watched from directions that did not match the sounds surrounding him. Then the camera captured a shape moving behind him with strangely delayed motion, almost like each part lagged behind the rest. Relda refused to describe the figure in any detail when questioned later. She only said its movement broke her sense of how bodies were supposed to shift through space. She ordered the ravine sealed and continued the search toward a ridge that rose above the grove. On the ridge, they found Nalan's field recorder stuck between two stones. It held one final file stamped shortly before the trail cameras stopped functioning. The audio began with Nalan breathing hard and saying he needed to reach higher ground because something kept answering him with a distorted version of his own voice. He whispered that the mimicry sounded close but arrived with a slight delay, almost like hearing an echo form before the original sound. The next part of the audio captured a heavy snap, followed by a low rumbling tone that shook the recorder's microphone in uneven pulses. The tone rose sharply, then cut out. After that, the file turned to static, broken by brief fragments of something moving quickly through thick brush. No additional speech followed. Detectives expanded the search for several days, but found no more signs of Nalan. Wildlife specialists reviewed the tracks and ruled out known species. Audio technicians studied the recorder file and claimed the mimicry did not follow human speech patterns. They also said the background rumbling showed overlapping frequencies not normally produced by natural events. The most controversial piece of evidence remained the unreleased footage retrieved from the second camera. Multiple officers stated privately that the final seconds made them step back from the screen. One officer said the shape behind Nalan appeared to form from shifting darkness rather than a physical figure. Another said the shape moved with delayed motion, almost like each part followed a separate pattern. Relda submitted a report stating that releasing the footage would cause unnecessary panic due to the unclear nature of the figure. She also wrote that the footage did not prove criminal activity or wildlife threat. That claim frustrated many who knew the case because they believed the clip held critical clues about Nalan's last moments. The official search ended with no resolution. The agency placed a warning sign near the trailhead advising visitors to stay on marked routes and avoid the grove during low light. Locals said the forest felt different in the weeks that followed. Some claimed the air carried faint tones at dusk that sounded almost like someone humming in slow, uneven intervals. Relda closed the investigation with a brief note. She wrote that the decision to withhold the footage came from her belief that the forest contained an auditory phenomenon that humans were not equipped to interpret safely. She said the footage captured that phenomenon too clearly, and that the delay in the shape's movement suggested something she could not explain. The case remains unsolved. People who hike near the grove say they sometimes hear a second set of footsteps behind them that stop a moment after they stop walking. A few report a voice repeating their words in a strained whisper. Authorities dismiss those stories as echoes caused by unusual terrain, yet the warning sign remains. The final memory card sits locked in an evidence drawer labeled with a note written by Relda. It states that the last seconds of the clip show Nalin turning towards something that does not match human or animal motion. It ends with a line that became central to local rumors. The note claims the figure appeared shaped by darkness rather than lit by it, and that detectives refused to release the footage because they could not explain why it seemed to move slightly after the forest around it had gone still. Nobody believed the ranger until they heard his final radio call. The title came from a set of recordings that park staff kept locked away for years, and they said the last call changed how the entire region treated missing hiker reports. The story centered on a ranger named Tobin Rusk, who worked long seasons in a national forest that stretched across rugged peaks and deep valleys. He was 37 and steady in his job, and he spent most days hiking remote trails to check campsites and weather conditions. That morning, he planned a simple route toward an overlook known for strong winds, and he packed light gear before heading out. He left the station with a radio clipped to his vest and told the dispatcher he would return by late afternoon. The sky looked clear as he started up the trail, and he enjoyed the quiet rhythm of his boots hitting the dirt. He passed a few hikers who warned him about strange noises near a side ridge, but he dismissed it as wind moving through narrow gaps. Tobin reached a fork near midday and decided to check an unmarked path that led toward an old fire tower. He had walked it before, but never alone for an extended stretch. As he moved deeper into the trees, he noticed the usual mountain sounds fading until only his footsteps remained. He paused to listen and realized even the birds were quiet. A faint metallic clatter sounded somewhere ahead, and he marked the direction in his notebook in case it related to trail maintenance. The incident began when he reached the fire tower clearing and saw the lower steps covered with disturbed soil. The prints looked human, yet inconsistent with normal hikers. They crossed each other in short, tight patterns, like someone moved back and forth repeatedly. Tobin bent down to examine the edges and noted that the impressions appeared fresh, despite no reports of workers in the area. He radioed the station and mentioned possible unauthorized activity, but received only static. He climbed the first few steps of the tower and saw a thin line of fabric caught on a nail, and it looked like part of a backpack strap. The fibers appeared stretched as if pulled by force. He photographed it and stored the fragment in a small bag. When he stepped back down, he saw a second set of prints that had not been there minutes earlier. These prints pointed directly toward the trees where he had been standing, and the spacing suggested deliberate, slow steps. The complication deepened when Tobin followed the new track line for 30 yards and found a circle of disturbed earth near a fallen log. A small metal tag lay in the dirt with the number 14 stamped into it, and he recognized it as an old campsite marker retired years ago. He wondered how it ended up here since the current map showed no active sites within miles. He knelt to photograph it and heard a low dragging sound behind him that stopped as soon as he turned. Tobin checked the trees and called, "Is someone out here?" But no answer came except a faint echo from the ridge. He reported possible movement on the east slope, and this time the radio crackled with a partial reply that ended mid-sentence. He tried again, but heard only wind sliding through the static. He felt pressure settle in his chest as he realized he stood in a place where normal signals should remain clear. He decided to retreat toward the main trail, but kept tracking the prints for evidence. As he moved down slope, he found a torn map with the corner ripped away, and the tear matched the same frayed pattern as the fabric from the tower. The map showed a route that ended near an old service road long abandoned after a landslide years earlier. Tobin suspected someone used the closed road recently because he saw tire grooves half hidden by pine needles. He took more photos and kept moving until he reached a narrow ravine. The investigation sharpened when he heard a short burst on his radio. The dispatcher repeated his name, followed by a warning that another hiker filed a distressed call from somewhere near the same ridge. Tobin tried to respond, but his radio cut out again. He climbed through the ravine and found an old emergency marker with numbers scratched off. Nearby, he spotted a small piece of foil that looked like the lining from an energy bar, and it appeared freshly torn. He finally reached the abandoned service road and saw impressions on the shoulder that matched the earlier prints. A broken trekking pole lay near the base of a boulder, and the handle had deep grooves consistent with strong pressure. He knelt to examine it and heard a sharp cracking noise from the opposite side of the road. Something moved behind the trees in a controlled, deliberate pattern. It paused each time he stepped. Tobin raised his radio and said, "Station, I need units on the old service road near marker 14, but static swallowed most of his message." He tried again and heard a faint answer that sounded cut short by interference. He stepped back slowly and kept his eyes on the tree line. He saw no clear figure, yet sensed someone watching him closely. The air felt charged and heavy, and a distant thud echoed along the slope. He walked toward the road's bend and saw a collapsed section where the landslide once cut through. Fresh dirt lined the edge as if someone climbed up recently. He scanned the slope and found small shreds of fabric caught on sharp rocks. They matched the same color as the earlier strap. He felt the weight of every clue pressing against his nerves. Whoever moved through the area left signs that did not align with normal hiker behavior. Tobin tried the radio again and finally reached the dispatcher. He said, "There is someone out here copying tracks and moving through the trees," followed by a burst of static. The dispatcher asked him to repeat, but Tobin suddenly froze as he saw a face watching him from between the trunks. It vanished before he blinked. He whispered, "Someone is following me," and the dispatcher told him to return to visible ground immediately. The twist hit when Tobin reached the ridgeline and saw two sets of prints merge into a single path that curved behind him. He realized someone had been mirroring his movement while leaving staggered impressions to confuse direction. He felt a presence close behind, but heard no breath or step. The radio came alive with a final message from the dispatcher speaking urgently. Tobin responded with his last transmission, the one that later convinced everyone something real happened that day. He said, "I see him now," followed by a long pause filled with uneven static. Then he said, "He has my other radio. He is repeating my calls," and his voice sounded strained. The final sound captured a second voice that repeated Tobin's last words in a distorted tone. The line cut out after a sharp impact. Units arrived 20 minutes later, yet they found no sign of him except his vest near the overlook rail. The button came when investigators reviewed the audio and heard the echoed voice clearly repeating Tobin's words. No one dismissed his claims after that. Search teams never found more than fragments scattered along the ridge, and the old service road remained closed. Rangers still avoid the fire tower path near sunset, and they train new staff to respond carefully to mismatched radio calls. They say Tobin's final message remains the strongest proof that he was never alone on that ridge. The case that locals warned the sheriff not to reopen. Old deputies used this title when talking about a file that sat untouched for years, and they claimed the warning came from people who lived near a forgotten stretch of woods. They said the case changed a sheriff's career in ways he never explained, and the town grew uneasy whenever someone brought it up again. The story began when Sheriff Lowell Brandt, who was 42 and steady in his work, returned to his office after a late patrol in early autumn. Lowell served in a small rural county where most calls involved livestock, weather damage, or simple disputes, and he liked the slow pace. That day, he planned to review routine reports before heading home for dinner, and he grabbed a few folders from the evidence room. He noticed an old green file tucked behind newer binders that looked brittle around the edges. The label contained a year written in faded ink that read 1999, and a short note beneath it read restricted by prior order. He set the file aside while finishing his regular work, yet his curiosity grew as he remembered stories he heard as a rookie. Several locals once told him never to bring up anything about a missing boy near the eastern timberline, and they warned new deputies to avoid questions about that area. Lowell figured the file might relate to those rumors, and he opened it while the station grew quiet. The first page described a search for a boy named Niall Granger, who disappeared near a trail close to abandoned cabins. The initial report claimed Niall wandered ahead of his older cousins during a family outing, and he vanished near a bend where the trail narrowed beside thick brush. Deputies wrote that they found no clear tracks, and the search lasted 8 hours before shifting to a broader grid. Lowell read that volunteers reported strange noises near dusk, though deputies dismissed those statements as wind moving through the trees. A short line at the end of the page ordered all follow-up reports transferred to sealed storage after a supervisor review. Lowell felt uneasy as he read because the wording looked rushed, and the next pages contained only fragments of interview notes. Witnesses claimed they heard a shout that did not match the boy's voice, and someone reported seeing a shadow between two cedar trees even after the search area was cleared. Those notes ended abruptly without signatures. Lowell thought the case deserved proper closure, so he decided to check the old search site during his next patrol. The incident shift began when he drove to the eastern timberline the following afternoon, and he parked near a gravel turnout beside heavy brush. The air felt strangely still as he walked toward the trail, and he saw the remains of rotting fence posts leaning toward the tree line. He followed the path until he reached the bend described in the old file. He noticed a narrow side trail that did not appear in recent maps and saw faint impressions in the soil that looked different from animal tracks. Lowell crouched to examine the ground and felt something firm beneath the loose dirt. He brushed aside debris and uncovered a piece of metal that looked like an old badge number tag. The number did not match any deputy badge he recognized, and he placed it in an evidence bag. Nearby, he saw a tree trunk with deep vertical scratches that looked as if a tool or heavy object caused them. He took several photos before walking deeper along the narrow trail. The complication grew when he reached the first cabin site, and he saw that someone had removed parts of the old structure recently. Fresh sawdust gathered near the doorway, and footprints circled the foundation. The cabin's interior smelled like old smoke mixed with damp earth. On the floor, he found a torn piece of a backpack strap that matched the description from the 1999 report. He wondered why this area showed signs of recent activity despite being officially unused. As he documented the scene, he heard leaves shift behind him with a rhythm that suggested a careful step rather than an animal. He called out, and a man in his late 60s emerged from behind a cedar trunk. The man introduced himself as Orrin Hale and said he lived on the other side of the ridge. Orrin warned Lowell that the place carried old problems, and he said the search from 1999 did not end the way the county claimed. He mentioned that volunteers found evidence that deputies refused to log. Orrin said one volunteer found fabric near a hollow stump that matched the boy's shirt pattern, yet the lead deputy ordered them to ignore it. He also claimed the search lines were altered on the second day without explanation. Lowell asked why the information never reached official channels, and Orrin said people stopped talking after 2 volunteers reported hearing a low voice near the creek bed. Orrin added that the voice sounded like someone calling out, but not in a normal tone. Lowell wrote everything in his notepad and asked Orrin if anyone still visited the area. Orrin hesitated before admitting that some men from another county had been seen near the cabins recently. He said they came at odd hours and left before dawn. Orrin believed they searched for something buried long before the boy disappeared. Lowell asked if they were connected to the original case, and Orrin only said they knew more than they ever admitted. The investigation deepened when Lowell returned to the station and ran the badge number through old records. The system produced a discontinued listing for a deputy named Marvin Dross, who served during the late 90s. Marvin resigned suddenly in 2000, and no reason appeared in the personnel file. Lowell checked newspaper archives for any mention of Marvin after his resignation. He found a small note saying Marvin moved away and later refused interviews about the missing boy case. Lowell contacted a retired dispatcher who confirmed that Marvin led the second-day search. She also recalled unexplained gaps in the radio log during several key hours. She said the search area changed because Marvin insisted the boy wandered farther than the family believed. When Lowell mentioned the badge fragment, the dispatcher grew quiet and said she once heard Marvin shouting at another deputy near the evidence tent during the search. She never learned what caused the argument. Lowell revisited the timberline 2 days later with a clearer plan. He walked past the first cabin and followed a faint trail toward the creek bed. Near a cluster of moss-covered stones, he found another piece of fabric, partially buried under wet leaves. It looked like the same pattern from the original case notes. He took more photos and marked the location on his map. He then continued toward the creek and saw a small structure made from stacked stones that looked intentionally arranged. Inside the stone enclosure, he found an old flashlight with rusted edges and a small notebook sealed inside a plastic bag. The notebook belonged to Marvin Dross based on the handwritten name on the first page. Lowell read that Marvin searched alone near dusk on the second day and followed a sound he described as a distressed voice. He wrote that he found a small shoe near the creek and placed it inside his pack. Yet that shoe never appeared in the official report. Marvin claimed he felt someone watching him as he moved through the brush, and he wrote that shadows shifted between the cedar trees even when his light remained steady. His final note said he planned to return later without the others, and the rest of the pages were blank. Lowell closed the notebook and realized that critical evidence never reached proper files. He also realized someone likely returned to the scene to retrieve missing items from that period. The twist became clear when Lowell returned to the station and compared Marvin's notebook timeline to the archives. The hours Marvin worked alone matched the same period when the radio log went silent. Lowell confronted the current undersheriff about the sealed file and asked why the case never received a full review. The undersheriff warned him that older residents pressured the office to leave the matter alone because reopening it would expose failures that might damage several families. According to the undersheriff, the search inaccurately mapped the boy's last known position, and a deputy lost track of a clue that should have shifted the entire grid. When Lowell asked about the shoe mentioned in the notebook, the undersheriff said he never saw it and believed someone removed key items before the files were sealed. He admitted that reopening the case would draw unwanted attention to the department's past mistakes. Lowell decided to file an internal request to unseal the remaining pages, yet he received calls from several residents that same evening. Each caller urged him to leave the case alone and claimed reopening it would bring more trouble than answers. One caller said the family of the missing boy moved away because they learned about irregularities in the investigation. Another caller mentioned seeing unfamiliar men near the timberline again, and he warned Lowell to stay away from that area. Lowell hesitated for several days as he reviewed every note from the scene. He knew the evidence pointed toward overlooked mistakes rather than something impossible, and he believed someone attempted to hide those mistakes by burying files. He compiled the found items into a new report that forced a small review, and the county quietly agreed to release a statement acknowledging flaws in the original search. The button came when Lowell returned to the timberline one final time and stood near the creek where Marvin wrote his last note. He felt the quiet air around him and listened to the steady flow of water moving between stones. The case never received a full reopening, yet the evidence he uncovered ensured the truth no longer sat in a forgotten box. Locals still warned people not to disturb the old trail, but Lowell believed avoiding the past never protected anyone. He knew the truth lived in the details scattered across the woods, waiting for someone willing to look closely.